Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little bizarre. Something that might make you clutch your pearls if you own any. You're about to time travel into the prim, proper and totally unhinged world of Victorian fun. Spoiler. You probably won't survive this era with your modern dignity intact. Or your freedom. But let's be real, they'd think your Bluetooth speaker was witchcraft. So fair's fair. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know who's wide awake with me right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin, where else? In the graveyard. You step out of your carriage, parasol poised just so, and inhale the sweet scent of fresh oil and distant decay. Around you, other well-dressed folks are laying out embroidered blankets atop the grass between headstones. A plump lady in the morning black opens a basket, revealing roast chicken and rhubarb pudding. A young man with mutton chops sets up a croquet set directly next to a crumbling tomb. And just a few feet away, a toddler is sticking flowers into the mouth of a weathered angel statue. You're not at a funeral, you're at a picnic. In the 1800s, especially in cities like London, cemeteries were more than death's waiting room. They were Sunday hotspots. Families would dress in their best, pack up a lavish spread, and head out to the graveyard for lunch. Not to mourn, not to pray, just to vibe. These weren't empty green fields either. Victorian graveyards were built like parks. Winding paths, manicured shrubs, stately monuments, and shade trees perfect for lounging under. You, modern viewer, might be thinking, that's deeply unsettling. But for Victorians, death wasn't a door you shut, it was a living room you kept dusted. They had a whole aesthetic about it. Mourning attire was practically its own industry, and cemeteries were a chance to socialise and show off, sort of like an Instagram carousel of who died richest. And hey, the logistics made sense too. Overcrowded cities didn't leave much green space for relaxing. Cemeteries were often some of the only open land with actual grass. It wasn't all lounging and lemonade though. Some visitors brought musical instruments, others read aloud from Gothic novels, yes, right there beside the dearly departed. And don't be surprised if someone invited you to a séance after dessert. There's even documented evidence that courting couples would stroll through cemeteries as a date activity. You're strolling arm in arm with your crush, pausing to read grave inscriptions like, "Here lies Ethel, devoted wife and collector of rare spoons," and trying not to trip over someone's grandfather. Now here's your quirky fact of the night. Victorian cemeteries had rules. Very specific ones. Like no dogs, no swearing, and absolutely no picking flowers off graves unless you wanted a firm talking to from the groundskeeper. But they also enforced dress codes. You could literally be turned away from a graveyard for showing too much forearm. Yeah, tell that to your gym bros. Of course, this all raises a bit of a debate in the dusty corners of historical academia. Was this cemetery culture an act of healthy normalisation of death? Or was it a subtle denial of mortality itself? Some kind of lace-curtained coping mechanism? Scholars still argue whether these graveyard hangouts reflected a society more at peace with dying, or one quietly terrified of it. Maybe both. Maybe neither. That's the Victorian brand, really. Elegant contradiction with a dash of tea. And while it sounds calming in a spooky Miss Havisham kind of way, here's where the arrest-worthy part comes in. Try this now. Go to your nearest cemetery with a cheese plate, a stereo and a folding chair. Set up shop next to a grave, let your kids run around, pop open a bottle of wine. I give it, 12 minutes before someone calls the cops? The park ranger? Your mother? Modern laws around cemeteries are a lot stricter. Trespassing, alcohol bans, noise ordinances, and general public decency expectations. Society flipped. What was once a communal garden of death is now sacred and silent. Cemeteries today are for mourning and reflection, not charades and sandwiches. But as you sit on that plaid blanket between marble angels and carved urns, one hand on your teacup, the other brushing biscuit crumbs off your lap, it kind of hits you. These people weren't just playing with death. They were making it part of life, a part of Sunday. And sure, it's weird, but it's also kind of cozy. So sip your tea, admire the ironwork fences, and try not to knock over that urn behind you. The next party you're headed to, let's just say it involves a goose, a blindfold, and some very questionable betting behaviour. The goose is honking, loudly, frantically, and honestly, you can't blame it. It's been plucked bald except for a tiny trembling puff of feathers on its head, and now it's been tied by one leg to a post in the centre of a muddy yard. Around it, a jeering crowd of men, most drunk, a few shirtless, despite the chill, are placing bets and sapping coins into each other's palms. You're standing just out of reach of the splash zone, wondering what fresh madness this is. Welcome to goose-pulling, the sport of gentlemen. Well, Victorian gentlemen, which, as you'll learn, is not the same thing. Here's how it goes. The goose is strung up, hanging just high enough to be barely reachable from horseback. Competitors take turns galloping past at full speed, trying to yank the goose down by its neck. The catch? The goose is alive, slippery, and, understandably, not into this. Most of the time, the poor thing's neck is greased to make it harder to grip, to raise the stakes. It's like a claw machine from hell, except instead of a stuffed bear, you're going for a panicking animal that flaps and bites. Bonus points if you do it without falling off your horse and face-planting into the mud. And here's the thing, this was considered fun. The crowd cheers, someone passes a jug of gin. Children dart between legs, mimicking the riders and pretending to yank invisible geese out of the sky. A local farmer wins 3 shillings after betting on the guy with the biggest moustache. The rider himself grins, lifts the limp goose in triumph, and is immediately invited to a pub dinner, where presumably that same goose is roasted and served. If this all sounds like a nightmare wrapped in a fever dream, that's because it kinda was. But back then, bloodsport and entertainment were regular dance partners. Goose-pulling was just one variation. Other days, it might be cockfighting, bear baiting, or watching ferrets chase rats through barrels. The line between cruelty and sport was not just blurry, it was pretty much non-existent. In fact, during the 1800s, public animal sports were a booming industry. Betting was at the core of it. Whole villages would show up for events, not just to watch, but to gamble. It wasn't just about the thrill of victory, it was about who walked home a few coins richer and whose pride got trampled under a goose's flailing foot. Now let's toss in a little known but very real detail. In some versions of the game, the goose was already dead. They'd kill it beforehand and then grease the neck. That sounds marginally more humane, until you remember it still involves hooting crowds and tug-of-war from horseback. Other times, they'd use a duck or a rabbit, or whatever animal someone had on hand that day. Flexibility, folks. Victorian hobbies were nothing if not resourceful. You might ask, how did this ever become acceptable? Well, here's where the scholars step in, wagging their fingers and raising their eyebrows. Some argue goose-pulling had medieval roots, passed down from knights who needed to hone horseback precision. Others say it was a rougher evolution of rural harvest festivals, when folks were already tipsy and looking for ways to spice things up. There's even debate over whether it was a metaphor, pulling luck from chaos, wrangling fortune by the neck. Either way, nobody was writing op-eds about goose rights in 1840. That said, it was controversial, just not in the way you think. Animal cruelty as a concept hadn't fully crystallised, but growing urbanisation brought more public scrutiny. As city populations ballooned and leisure became more performative, activities like goose-pulling were increasingly seen as low class. It wasn't wrong necessarily, it was just embarrassing, like admitting you still enjoy slapstick comedy, or TikTok. Eventually Queen Victoria's influence, plus a rising middle-class obsession with refinement, pushed such sports into the shadows. Laws caught up slowly. The cruelty to animals. Act of 1835 was a start, though enforcement was spotty. Goose-pulling didn't vanish overnight, but it did migrate. To back alleys, to rural corners, to whispered invitations behind pubs. And today, try goose-pulling in your neighbourhood and see what happens. You'll make the evening news and not in the heartwarming local man rides horse and spreads tradition segment. Animal cruelty laws are now among the more strictly enforced in many countries. That includes public harm, staged violence, and, you guessed it, anything involving non-consensual goose-related stunts. So yes, if you decided to douse a goose's neck in olive oil, string it up in your driveway, and then gallop past on your cousin's horse to cheers from your neighbours, you'd be arrested. Immediately. Possibly tackled mid-gallop by a SWAT team. But don't worry, the Victorians weren't finished with bizarre bets and feathered violence. Because while this sport faded, the desire to watch living things be manhandled for fun did not. Let's just say the next few decades got weirder. And while you're still shaking that image from your head, consider this fringe fact. In some parts of Europe, goose-pulling survived well into the 20th century. long after the Victorian period ended. In Spain, the Netherlands, and even parts of rural Germany, it persisted as a folk tradition. Sometimes they even dressed up the goose. I mean, if you're going to be brutal, at least be festive. Now you're beginning to see the pattern here. The Victorians, in all their buttoned-up glory, were often just hiding chaos behind a lace curtain. Which makes you wonder what's next, right? How about a little light entertainment featuring real people treated like sideshow attractions? Yep. Up next, freak shows, where your body became someone else's punchline and your livelihood. You're standing under a heavy red and white striped tent, the air thick with the scent of sawdust, sweat, and a hint of roasted peanuts. Around you, murmurs ripple through the crowd as people press closer to the stage. A man in a tall stovepipe hat and a suit that somehow looks both dapper and greasy steps into the spotlight. He twirls his moustache, bows deeply, and shouts with theatrical glee, "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, prepare your eyes and your minds for the most astonishing sights ever to grace this earthly plane." The music flares, a jittery carnival tune played slightly out of tune, and the curtain parts to reveal a small woman standing suddenly, her facial features unique enough to catch your breath. A few people gasp, some giggle, most just stare. Welcome to the Victorian freak show, where entertainment came with a side of exploitation and people's bodies became marketable curiosities. This isn't just a one-off sideshow, this is the show. In the 1800s, freak shows were a staple of popular entertainment. You'd find them attached to travelling circuses, county fairs, music halls, and even standalone theatres. They were billed as both scientific exhibits and sensational marvels, blurring the line between education and good old-fashioned gawking. And you, dear visitor, would have paid a shiny penny or two to see what the posters promised. The tallest man in England, the bearded lady from Bavaria, the Siamese twins who played the piano with perfect synchronization. At first, it's kind of dazzling. There's an aura of mystery and showmanship, but then you start to really look, and it hits differently. These aren't magical creatures, these are people. Some with medical conditions, some born with physical differences, some just really, really short, or really, really hairy, or from a colonised country and willing to play savage for an audience of gasping Brits, and you begin to feel the twist in your gut. Now let's be clear, some performers in these shows had a surprising amount of control. Take Joseph Merrick, the so-called Elephant Man. While his life was marked by cruelty and misunderstanding, his later years in London found him somewhat protected by friends and scholars. Or look at Chang and Engbunker, conjoined twins from Siam, now Thailand, who actually managed their careers and eventually married and settled in North Carolina. Yes, married, yes, both of them, to sisters, Victorian tabloid gold. Some exhibits were not even physically different at all, just foreign. Entire tribes from Africa or Asia would be brought to England and displayed in living ethnological exhibitions. Victorians would gawk at them in constructed native villages, as if they were animals in a zoo. And in a particularly dark twist, these shows were often justified under the guise of anthropological study. That's right, they didn't just call it fun, they called it science. But let's not glaze over the darker realities. Many performers, especially those with visible disabilities or extreme conditions, were exploited. Their contracts could be misleading or non-existent. Some were bought outright or leased like property. They endured long tours, poor pay, brutal work conditions, and relentless public scrutiny. Privacy, dignity, forget it. You were the bearded woman, the lobster boy, the pinhead, that was your identity, on and off stage. And audiences? They laughed. They stared. They applauded. Sometimes they heckled. The vibe was less sympathetic curiosity and more human zoo with the popcorn. Now here's a juicy Victorian fringe fact for you. One of the most popular performers of the time, General Thumb, was a little person named Charles Stratton, who began performing for P.T. Barnum at the age of 4. Barnum taught him to drink wine, smoke cigars, and mimic Napoleon. By the time he was 10, he'd performed for royalty and was considered one of the most famous people in the world. Child labour laws? What are those? Of course, not everyone in the era thought this was okay. A growing number of reformers, particularly near the end of the 19th century, began to question the ethics of freak shows. Were these exhibitions degrading? Was it moral to put people with disabilities on display for profit? Or was it a legitimate livelihood for people who would otherwise be pushed even further to society's margins? Scholars still chew on that debate. Some argue that for many performers, it was a way to take ownership of their own narrative and earn a living. Others say it was just a prettier cage, a way of packaging humiliation and calling it a career. The truth, somewhere in between. As usual, but let's swing it back to today. Imagine walking into a county fair and seeing a booth labelled "The Amazing Bearded Lady" or "Come See the Wild Bushmen of Africa." You wouldn't be intrigued, you'd be furious, and rightly so. Discrimination laws, disability rights movements, and general human decency have, thankfully, changed the way we think about people with differences. Putting a real person behind a curtain and charging admission to stare at them, that's not just unethical, it's illegal. You'd be sued, cancelled, arrested, possibly all three in that order. Still, the echoes of Victorian freak shows are out there. Reality TV, social media, influencer culture. People still monetize spectacle, but now it's voluntary, or at least it's supposed to be. So as you leave that striped tent and the echo of carnival laughter fades behind you, you might ask yourself, are we really so different? Or did we just change the venue? Up next, we take a hard turn from the stage to the steeple, where babies are tossed into the air during christenings, and everyone's totally fine with it. You've been invited to a christening. It's a bright Sunday morning, and the church bells are doing their melodramatic thing in the distance. Everyone's dressed to the nines, corsets cinched to dangerous levels, moustaches waxed into sharp points, bonnets perched like small ships on heads. You're standing near the back of the churchyard, trying not to make eye contact with the vicar, when suddenly someone shouts, "Ready the baby!" A cheer goes up, and then, and you're not hallucinating this, a red-faced squirming infant is tossed into the air like a sack of flour. For a moment the child is airborne, limbs flailing, christening gown billowing like a parachute. Someone catches it, just barely. Another cheer erupts. You stand there with your mouth open, wondering if you've walked into a very niche Victorian flash mob. But no, this is real. This is a tradition. Welcome to the strange world of baby tossing, a real and enthusiastically practiced activity during the Victorian era. Especially in certain rural areas of Britain and Europe, christenings weren't just solemn religious ceremonies, they were events. Loud, joyous, and deeply chaotic. And tossing the baby? That was the grand finale. Now, before you report everyone involved to Child Protective Services, know that this wasn't just random madness. In some cultures, tossing the baby was thought to bring good luck. It symbolised offering the child up to heaven, then welcoming them back down to earth, now blessed and protected. A divine game of hot potato, if you will. Of course, there were risks. Some tosses were small, ceremonial, more of a light lift than a launch. Others, not so much. There are old tales, half folklore, half warning, of babies being tossed too high, or caught by the tips of fingers instead of firm hands. No safety nets, no spotters, just lace gloves, slippery hands, and a strong faith in divine reflexes. This wasn't limited to christenings either. Victorians had an odd fondness for dangling babies from ridiculous heights, especially for photos. That's right, there are actual surviving photographs of infants being dangled over balconies, held by one ankle, sometimes with amused siblings looking on. What was the purpose? Mostly just to get a rise out of whoever looked at the photo. A Victorian kind of trolling. Speaking of photos, let's not forget this was the era of post-mortem photography too, which, don't worry, we'll get to later. But for now, just know that their idea of what was normal around children and danger was not our idea. Safety standards? They hadn't been invented yet. Helmets? Nope. Baby monitors? You were lucky if the baby had its own bed. Now here's a little-known fact. In some parts of northern Spain, baby tossing has survived in a heavily tamed-down form. There's a festival called El Calacho, where babies are laid on mattresses in the street and masked men leap over them to cleanse them of sin. No, the babies aren't flung into the air, but yes, someone is literally jumping over infants. So this sort of thing didn't completely die out, it just got rebranded. Victorian England, though, had its own particularly spicy flavour. Some christening parties even incorporated games involving baby passing contests. Picture it, a line of 8 relatives all sloshed on sherry and port, hurling a giggling baby from person to person like it's an Olympic event. People would place bets on how many times the baby could be passed before someone dropped it, or before the baby projectile vomited. If it sounds insane, that's because it absolutely was, but to them it was just another charming part of family life. And here's where the academic debate sneaks in like a judgmental schoolmaster. Was this a form of community bonding? A ritual of joy and shared responsibility, where everyone in the village took a turn holding and lobbing the future generation? Or was it a thinly disguised display of dominance over the helpless, a way of publicly asserting control over new life under the pretense of tradition? Some historians argue that such rituals serve to reinforce group ties in tight-knit communities. The act of literally trusting your neighbours not to drop your baby symbolised a deep cultural trust. Others think it's all just Victorian machismo turned into a party trick. You could go either way. Maybe it was both, maybe people are just weird. And now, let's bring this home. Try tossing a baby in public today. Go ahead, find a public park, grab a baby, ideally your own, and hurl it 3 feet in the air while a group of your friends claps. Best case, people scream. Worst case, someone tackles you. Either way, Child Protective Services is getting involved. Hard. Modern parenting is a tightly regulated social performance. You're judged for using the wrong kind of bottle, let alone yeeting a child into the stratosphere for good luck. And insurance policies? Don't even try explaining to your provider why your infant broke a collarbone mid-air. But back then, no one blinked. In fact, if you didn't toss the baby, some folks would side-eye you like you were jinxing the child. This was an era when children were expected to be tough from day one. Infancy wasn't a bubble. It was a trial by fire. Or, trial by gravity. So as the baby lands safely, miraculously in Aunt Mildred's arms, and someone pops open another bottle of celebratory brandy, you realise something both hilarious and horrifying. Victorian fun was often just high-stakes survival dressed in lace. And if you thought this was nerve-wracking, wait until you sit down for a tea party laced with opium and served with a knowing wink. You're at a tea party. Very elegant. Very respectable. There are doilies. There are cucumber sandwiches cut into perfect triangles. There's a harp playing softly in the corner, and enough perfume in the air to knock out a bull. The women are fanning themselves delicately, the men are swirling brandy and quoting Tennyson. Everything looks exactly how you think a Victorian tea party should look, except everyone is just a bit too relaxed. Their pupils are huge, their smiles are a little too slow, someone is giggling uncontrollably into a plate of scones. You, dear guest, have just stumbled into the more recreational side of the Victorian social scene. Opium dens and laudanum lounging, only this time it's dressed up with fine china and polite conversation, because nothing says refinement quite like casual narcotics before dinner. Let's talk about laudanum first. A miracle drug of its time, or so it was marketed, it was basically a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol. Think of it as the 9th century version of NyQuil, but way more addictive and likely to kill you. You could buy it at any corner apothecary. No prescription, no questions asked. It came in dainty little glass bottles with charming handwritten labels that made it look more like vanilla extract than a narcotic, capable of flattening your soul. And guess what? Everyone was using it. Everyone. Children, mothers, poets, dock workers, clergy. If you had a cough, a headache, a touch of melancholy, a bad tooth, a bad day, or just needed to sleep, laudanum was the go-to. It was poured into tea, mixed into tonics, rubbed on sore gums, or just sipped straight like a shot of Victorian espresso. You sit down on an embroidered chair and take a dainty sip from a porcelain teacup. The floral blend is pleasant, but there's something else in there. Something earthy. The woman beside you leans in and whispers, "That's the good stuff." It helps with the nerves. Then she promptly zones out, eyes fixed on the wallpaper like it's whispering secrets to her. Welcome to a laudanum lounge, the genteel cousin of the opium den. Unlike their seedier counterparts hidden in the fog-choked alleys of London's East End, these were more drawing-room chic. A private home, velvet drapes, soft music, the company of fellow delicate constitutions. Think country club meets controlled substance. Then there were the opium dens proper, typically associated with London's Chinese immigrant communities. These dens became infamous in both fiction and real life. Writers like Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle leaned into the smoky mystery of it all, painting opium dens as shadowy labyrinths of exotic danger. And yes, while some dens catered to working-class addicts, others catered to wealthy thrill-seekers chasing dreams in a haze of sweet-smelling smoke. Here's a fringe fact you probably didn't expect. Many of these dens had menus, as in actual printed lists of what strength or type of opium you wanted. Pipe rental, extra, silk pillow for your head included. It was less of a back alley vice and more of a customer experience. Bring your own matches. But it wasn't just the dens. Opium and its derivatives were literally everywhere. Cough syrup, opium, painkiller, opium, women's monthly comfort drops, opium, baby's teething syrup, you guessed it, opium. A product called Godfrey's Cordial was regularly used to knock infants out so they'd stop crying. It was nicknamed Mother's Quiet Friend, which is poetic and horrifying in equal measure. And here's where it gets spicy. You'd think such widespread use would spark some kind of moral panic. And you'd be right, but only later. During the height of the Victorian era, drug use was just part of the wallpaper. It wasn't until the addiction rates soared and people started literally dropping dead from overdoses that lawmakers began to notice. Even then, reform was slow, very slow. Laudanum wasn't officially regulated in the UK until the early 20th century. Until then, your local grocer was also, in effect, your friendly neighbourhood drug dealer. So what's the scholarly debate here? Some historians argue that the Victorians weren't fully aware of the dangers. They saw laudanum the way we see aspirin, miraculous, safe and effective. Others say, oh no, they knew, they just didn't care. Or at least they didn't care until it started impacting the respectable classes. When working class mothers were giving it to babies, it was quaint. When upper class ladies started hallucinating in public, it became a problem. And now, the obvious question, what happens if you tried this today? Let's be clear, you would be in so much legal trouble. Most laudanum-era narcotics are now classified as controlled substances. Try slipping an opium derivative into a party cocktail and you're going to jail, not to brunch. Even the act of hosting a casual narcotics tea would get you arrested, sued and possibly featured in a sensational daytime talk show about modern dangers in suburbia. Best case scenario, you're grounded by society. Worst case, you're indicted. But here's the kicker. Even today, echoes of this exist. Prescription opioid abuse is very much a modern issue. It's just dressed in lab coats and pharmacy labels instead of corsets and crystal decanters. We haven't evolved so much as rebranded. So that as the harpist plucks away and your fellow guests drift into dreamy silence, you feel your eyelids droop and your limbs turn warm and weightless. The walls shimmer. Time becomes a soup. And you realise you're high as a kite in a corset. And this, my friend, was just another Thursday for the Victorians. Ready for more? Good. Because next we're going into the sewers. Literally. You're about to meet the children who played and worked in the filth for pocket change and laughs. You step outside, blinking the opium haze from your eyes, if only in solidarity, and immediately wrinkle your nose. The city stinks, not just mildly unpleasant, but aggressively offensive, like something rotting inside a wet sock stuffed into another angrier sock. It's a pungent bouquet of horse dung, human waste, coal smoke, and something vaguely fishy that no one wants to identify. Welcome to Victorian London, home of fog, filth, and a population of children who literally made a living digging through human excrement. Yes, really. And their job had a name, mudlarking. You're standing now on the banks of the River Thames. The tide's gone out, exposing a greasy, trash-littered slope of shoreline. Bits of broken pottery, bones, nails, rags, and darker things glisten in the sludge. Down there, in the muck, knee-deep and barefoot, are kids, maybe 8, maybe 10 years old. Hard to tell under the layer of grime. They're poking through the sludge with sticks, bare hands, whatever they've got. Eyes sharp for anything they can sell. This, for many Victorian children, was both their playground and their career. A mudlark was typically a child or occasionally an elderly person who scavenged the tidal shores of the Thames for bits of coal, rope, metal, glass, or even half-rotten food. Anything that could be cleaned, repaired, or passed off to a pawnbroker. It was survival, but it was also, weirdly, entertainment. Kids laughed, swapped stories, dared each other to eat unspeakable things, and if you found a copper nail or an intact spoon, jackpot. Of course, mudlarking wasn't limited to the riverbanks. The real gritty fun happened deeper, literally in the sewers. Enter the sewer hunters, or as they were sometimes grimly nicknamed, toshers. These were the braver, smellier cousins of mudlarks, who crawled into the actual sewer tunnels to find coins, jewellery and other bits of treasure accidentally flushed by the city's wealthier residents. You wade behind one now, he's maybe 14, wearing a threadbare coat and a cap with a candle stub wedged into it. He lowers himself into a narrow brick tunnel, lit only by flickering candlelight and optimism. The air is thick, damp and suffocatingly foul. Rats skitter along the edges, bold and hungry, water sloshes around his boots. Or, wait, Is that even water? Don't think about it too hard. Inside, he pulls out a rusty spoon from a pile of sludge and holds it up like it's Excalibur. "Sixpence for this at the docks," he says with a grin, already scraping it clean with a fingernail. Now here's the part that blows your mind. This was normal. These weren't considered tragic child labourers. They were seen as resourceful, even lucky. Adults, when they weren't drunk or asleep, would sometimes join in, but kids were smaller, faster, and better at squeezing into tight corners, so they dominated the trade. And because London's infrastructure was, let's say, fluid, there was always something disgusting to dig up. Victorian newspapers occasionally ran sentimental stories about clever mudlark children who found a ring, returned it to its owner, and were rewarded with a new coat. But most of the time, these kids lived in slums, slept on sacks, and coughed up things they couldn't name. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In 1858, during the infamous Great Stink, the Thames became so rank that Parliament literally had to stop sessions because the smell through the windows was that overpowering. Lawmakers gagged behind lace handkerchiefs while mudlarks below continued their business as usual. If anything, the stench meant fewer rich people around, less chance of getting shooed away. So what do scholars say about all this? Some argue that mudlarking was a tragic symptom of poverty and urban neglect, a heartbreaking sign of a society failing its children. Others take a grittier, less sentimental view, that it was a form of adaptive entrepreneurship. These kids weren't waiting for charity. They were hustling, surviving, outwitting the city at its own game. Still, there's no denying the sheer risk. Cuts and infections were constant. Drowning was a real possibility. Tides on the Thames rise fast. The sewers were worse. Toxic gas build-ups, structural collapses, and the occasional alligator rumour, yes, even then made it a game of life or death. All for a few pennies and maybe a meat pie. Now picture this happening today. Imagine a gang of 12-year-olds knee-deep in a city's sewage system with buckets, looking for dropped AirPods and old coins. It would be a media scandal. Arrests would be made, there'd be documentaries, lawsuits, and a new charity launched within 24 hours. Save the Sewer Kids wristbands would trend by morning. Child labour laws, health regulations, and something called basic human decency have since taken the place of bootstraps and bravado. In most modern countries, a parent would lose custody for letting a kid play near an open drain, let alone sending them into a biohazard tunnel. But in the Victorian era, if you were poor, you worked. End of story. Childhood was a luxury, not a right. And if your job meant digging through human waste for bits of scrap metal, well, that just meant you were clever enough not to starve. So as you climb back out of the filth and wipe sludge from your boots, you might feel a strange mix of admiration and horror. The kids of Victorian London weren't just survivors. They were daredevils, hustlers, sewer pirates with nothing but a stick, a sack, and the sheer will to make something out of nothing. And speaking of public spectacles, you've now earned your spot in the crowd for one of the era's favourite pastimes, gathering with your neighbours to watch someone die. Yes, next up, public executions. Bring the kids. You're jostling through a crowd that stretches for blocks, shoulder to shoulder with Londoners of every stripe. Chimney sweeps, shopkeepers, pickpockets, drunk uncles, bored aristocrats in opera cloaks, entire families with crusty meat pies in hand. It's barely past sunrise, but there's an unmistakable buzz in the air, like the first note of a festival. You glance up at the grim stone facade of Newgate Prison. Atop a temporary wooden scaffold sits a thick beam and a dangling rope, swaying lazily in the breeze. Someone is about to die, and you've got front row standing room for the biggest ticket in town. Welcome to public execution day in Victorian England. Half morality play, half family outing with just a dash of blood and horror to wake you up properly. You push closer, elbowing past a group of teenage girls snacking on roasted chestnuts. A vendor hawks murderers' broadsheets, cheap, lurid pamphlets detailing the crime, the trial, and usually a made-up confession written by someone who wasn't there. For a penny, you can read all about the man set to hang today. Rumour has it he stole a horse. Others say he killed his wife. Either way, he's the main character now. And make no mistake, this is the event. The average hanging in London could attract 20 to 50,000 people, all packed in like a football match, minus the face paint and with way more crying children. Pubs opened early, street performers showed up. Merchants sold miniature noose charms and souvenir sketches. A good execution was like a royal wedding, but with more screaming. You look around, kids are hoisted onto shoulders, Couples hold hands. One man is writing in a notebook, trying to get a good quote for his newspaper column. You begin to realise something unsettling. No one here seems shocked. This isn't a mob. It's a mourning ritual. The prisoner emerges at last, led by guards flanked by a priest. He's dishevelled, pale, eyes scanning the crowd like he's trying to memorise faces. The crowd quiets, expectant. There's a final prayer mumbled by the priest, ignored by most. Then the noose, the lever, the drop, the silence breaks into a cheer. A few people wince, one woman faints, a child cries, but his mother hushes him and gives him a sweet. There now, it's over. Wasn't that something, she says, like they just watched a play. And here's the Victorian twist. This was considered good for you. A little moral realignment via death. Executions were seen as public lessons, deterrents. The state wanted you to see justice in action. That rope wasn't just for the condemned, it was a warning to everyone else. Steal a loaf, meet the hangman. Except, of course, it wasn't always that clean. The line between justice and spectacle blurred faster than a street urchin running from a bobby. Fun fringe fact. Some enterprising Victorians took execution enthusiasm to absurd levels. There were people who collected drops of blood from executed criminals on scraps of cloth, believing that it had magical or healing properties. Others snatched bits of the rope after the hanging, thought to bring good luck, like a four-leaf clover, but considerably more disturbing. And while the government promoted the deterrence idea, critics were not convinced. There was growing concern even then that public hangings weren't discouraging crime, they were glamorising it. When you turn someone into a folk anti-hero or sell their life story as street literature, you're not really reinforcing law and order, you're building legends. Plus, things didn't always go smoothly. There were botched executions, prisoners who strangled slowly instead of snapping instantly. Spectators sometimes fainted, vomited, or became violent. Not exactly family-friendly content. This is where the scholarly debate thickens. Some historians argue that public executions were a necessary tool for controlling an increasingly urbanised, chaotic population, especially with the rise of crime in slums and poverty-stricken areas. Others argue it was performative cruelty, a holdover from medieval times that had no place in a so-called modern empire. Eventually, public opinion began to turn. The sheer number of onlookers and the carnival atmosphere made it harder and harder to defend these events as sombre deterrents. Reformers lobbied, clergy protested, and writers like Charles Dickens openly condemned the practice. He described the crowds as drunk, savage, and unrepentantly entertained. Not exactly the pious masses the state liked to imagine. By 1868, public executions were finally banned in England. Hangings continued, but behind prison walls, away from the adoring or bloodthirsty public. The government declared it a move toward decency and progress. Some people mourned the loss of their favourite spectacle. Others were relieved they no longer had to dodge souvenir hunters trying to snatch bits of the gallows. And today, the idea of taking your kid to watch someone die sounds like the premise of a horror film. You'd be arrested, institutionalized, and probably disowned. The ethics of capital punishment remain deeply debated, but the public part, that's dead and buried. The state no longer wants an audience. Imagine announcing on Instagram, "Hey guys, heading to a state-sanctioned execution with the fam, #justice." No, you'd be banned, possibly flagged by the FBI. Even news coverage of executions is sterile and regulated. No photos, no public viewing, no snacks sold outside. But the Victorian era didn't just tolerate it, they thrived on it. Death wasn't tucked away, it was part of daily life, and sometimes the best show in town. So you turn away from the now empty scaffold, the crowd already dispersing toward alehouses and gossip circles, and realise you've just witnessed the ultimate blend of justice and theatre. Unapologetically raw, morally confusing, horrifyingly human, and just in time too, because the next event on your itinerary is way less fatal but no less brutal. We're heading to the town green, where two bare-knuckled boxers are about to beat each other into a Victorian coma. Let's go ringside. You follow the sound of shouting and fists smacking flesh until you reach the edge of a field packed with sweating, hollering Victorians, all gathered in a loose, boozy ring around two shirtless men who look like they were forged from leather, stubbornness, and unresolved father issues. One of them has a broken nose, freshly broken as of 5 minutes ago. The other is missing a tooth and currently spitting a mouthful of blood onto the grass with theatrical flair. Someone in the crowd yells, "Give him the left, Johnny!" while another man places a bet using what appears to be a goose. You've officially arrived at the bare-knuckle boxing match. The Victorian working-class answer to polite society's opera night. This isn't boxing like you know it. There are no gloves, no weight classes, and certainly no medical supervision. No ring ropes either, just a roped-off square in the middle of a muddy field and a lot of testosterone. The crowd serves as both barrier and witness. If someone falls into the onlookers, they just get pushed back in, possibly with an encouraging slap. The fighters circle each other, their hands curled into fists but held lower than you'd expect. Classic bare-knuckle stance, designed to protect the body more than the head. The next punch lands with a crack and someone near you cheers like they've just seen the Queen ride by topless. It's violent, it's loud, it's deeply fun, at least by 19th century standards. Victorian bare-knuckle boxing wasn't just a pastime, it was a social event, an economic engine, and for some, a full-blown career. Matches could last hours, with over 100 rounds, because rounds back then weren't timed, they ended only when someone hit the ground. You could be on round 93 and still have to fight 40 more if neither man stayed down. Imagine spending your Saturday repeatedly falling face first into grass and fists while your friends cheer and toss coins at you. For fun. And this wasn't all underground. For a while, bare-knuckle boxing was borderline legal. If not exactly approved, then at least tolerated. It thrived in rural fields, tavern yards, and eventually in travelling fight circuits. Promoters would set up matches, complete with printed flyers and prize purses. Spectators came from miles around, often placing bets that amounted to several weeks' wages. The stakes were high, especially if you were the one getting punched. The fighters themselves were often local legends. Many came from poor backgrounds, dock workers, labourers, coal miners, and fighting was a way to make fast cash and gain fame. If you were good enough, you could become a pugilistic celebrity, complete with newspaper write-ups and public rivalries. One of the most famous Victorian boxers, Tom Sayers, became so beloved that his funeral drew over 10,000 mourners. His dog even rode in the carriage. That's some next-level loyalty. But this wasn't just men being men in the mud. There were rules, sort of. The London Prize Ring Rules, established in 1838 and revised in 1853, outlined things like no hitting below the belt and no biting, which sounds civilised until you realise these were only necessary because people were, in fact, biting. Fighters could rest between rounds, but only if they made it back to their corner unassisted. If your second had to help you stand, match over. And yet these matches were full-blown community events. Whole villages turned out. Women attended too, not just as spectators, but occasionally as fighters. Yes, female bare-knuckle boxing was a thing, less common but documented. And no, the fights weren't delicate or restrained. One 18th century account describes a woman having her ear partially bitten off and still finishing the fight. Victorian femininity was apparently optional on fight day. Here's a weird little nugget. Some boxers greased their hair or bodies before a match to make it harder for their opponent to land a grip. Others used secret signals to throw matches and manipulate bets. Corruption and showmanship? As timeless as the black eye. Scholars debate the appeal. Was this the people's sport? A form of self-expression and upward mobility in a society stacked against the poor? Or was it state-sanctioned brutality? Allowed because the violence was neatly contained among those the elite already didn't care about? It's likely both. The same upper classes who tisked at bare-knuckle brawling were often the ones placing the biggest bets behind the scenes. Hypocrisy in a top hat. Eventually the sport evolved. Gloves became standard. Queensberry rules were introduced in 1810, emphasising timed rounds, weight divisions, and things like not dying mid-match. That marked the slow shift toward modern boxing, the kind you see on pay-per-view, still violent, still exploitative at times, but no longer held in muddy fields next to beer tents and pig stalls. Try holding an unlicensed bare-knuckle fight today, and see how fast the cops arrive. Even legal versions require permits, doctors, liability waivers, and an actual ring. Organising one in a public park, complete with betting and no gloves, would earn you headlines and handcuffs. Probably not in that order. Still, you can feel the pull of it here, standing in the damp grass, watching two sweaty Victorians pummel each other for pride and pennies. The crowd roars. One man is bleeding from the mouth, but he's grinning. This is the closest some of these people will ever get to glory, while in a society obsessed with status, this is one of the few ways to earn yours. in punches and scars, and as the next round begins and the fighters meet in the centre with raised fists and wild eyes, you realise something. The Victorians didn't just flirt with danger. They married it, took it to dinner, and introduced it to their children. Speaking of which, it's time for family portraits, but not the kind you're thinking. Get ready to pose with the deceased, and try to smile. You're in a dim parlour, thick with the scent of rosewater, lavender, and just beneath that, something faintly metallic. A black veil hangs over the window to block out the daylight, though the sun's barely risen. A clock ticks loudly in the corner, counting out each too long second. And in front of you sits a family arranged stiffly on a velvet settee. Father with his arm around his wife, 2 children standing on either side. In the middle, propped up slightly with cushions, is a third child dressed in lace and ribbons, eyes glassy and wide. Only she's not blinking, because she's dead. Welcome to the strange and sorrowful world of Victorian mourning photography, specifically post-mortem portraits, where grieving families would pose with their recently deceased loved ones for one final image. The result? Photographs that look serene, formal, and, let's not sugarcoat it, completely haunting. The practice wasn't rare. In fact, it was deeply woven into the fabric of Victorian grief. At a time when death was a near-constant visitor, especially among children, these photographs served as both a memorial and a last chance to capture the deceased's likeness. You couldn't scroll through digital albums back then. You might never have had a photo of your child or spouse while they were alive. So when death came knocking, the camera followed. You watch as the photographer sets up his clunky towering contraption, a wooden brass beast requiring long exposures and absolute stillness. That part's easy for the dead, obviously, not so much for the living. Everyone else holds unnaturally still, faces composed in polite grief, eyes fixed straight ahead. There were 2 styles. Some post-mortem photos clearly showed the deceased lying in repose, on a bed or coffin, often surrounded by flowers or religious symbols. These had a formal, almost ritualistic feel. Others were far more unsettling. The dead posed to appear alive, held upright in chairs using stands and wires, heads tilted just so, eyes sometimes painted onto closed lids after development. A dead child posed with her living siblings, a husband seated beside his lifeless wife, hands touching. These images were meant to comfort, but from your modern perspective they land somewhere between tragic and uncanny valley. Here's your quirky little fact. Many of these photos were proudly displayed in the home, not hidden, framed, mounted on mantels or walls alongside wedding pictures and baby portraits. Visitors might pause in front of one and say, "Oh, that's little Clara, she passed at 8. Beautiful child," as if she'd just moved away to the countryside instead of the great beyond. And it wasn't just for children. Elderly parents, lost lovers, soldiers killed in far-off battles. They all got their turn under the photographer's black shroud. Some studios specialised in post-mortem work. They'd have props ready, Bibles, angel wings, mourning wreaths, everything to create the illusion of peaceful sleep or divine passage. From a historical standpoint, scholars see these photos as deeply complex. On one side, they reflect the Victorian obsession with death, an era that turned grief into ritual, mourning into aesthetic. Black crepe dresses, mourning jewellery made from human hair, month-by-month rules for how long you should grieve depending on who died. These weren't casual practices, they were social expectations, but some historians argue these photos served a genuinely therapeutic role. In a time before grief counselling, before support groups and online forums, having a tangible image of the dead might have offered real comfort. Something to hold on to. A bridge between what was and what would never be again. Others counter that the practice reinforced a kind of emotional repression, that instead of processing loss, the Victorians sanitised it, made it pretty, froze it in place, turned the dead into dolls and posed them under lace. It's hard not to wonder how a child felt standing next to her dead sister, ordered not to fidget while the shutter clicked. And yet, there's a tenderness in many of these photos that modern eyes miss at first glance. The way a father's hand rests gently on his daughter's shoulder. The way a mother's eyes seem more hollow than posed. They're not faking grief. They're just doing what they know, what their culture allows to express it. Today, of course, this would never fly. You can't walk into a modern photography studio and ask to schedule a portrait session with a deceased relative. Well, you could, but the photographer would probably back away slowly and call someone in a uniform. Mortuary rules, health codes, and general cultural norms strictly limit how the dead can be handled and presented. And then there's the legal side. In most countries, transporting or displaying a body outside of approved medical or funeral settings is, at best, a serious violation. At worst, it's a felony. Even photographing a body requires strict permissions, typically for documentation, not keepsakes. But despite that, post-mortem photography hasn't completely vanished. In some modern cultures and niche communities, the idea has evolved into gentler practices, like professional remembrance photography for stillborn children or families with terminal infants. These are handled with extreme care and consent, always with the dignity of the deceased front and centre. Still, the idea of sitting down next to your dead uncle in a suit smiling for the camera, not something you'll see on Shutterfly. And yet, as you step back from the tableau in the parlour, it's hard not to feel a strange respect. The Victorians didn't hide death behind sterile hospital curtains. They dressed it, framed it, photographed it. It wasn't a horror to be erased. It was a reality to be acknowledged, maybe not always wisely, maybe not always gently, but definitely always head-on. Now brush off your mourning shawl because we're moving on to something a little livelier. And by livelier, I mean a tea party featuring a collection of squirrels in tiny hats. Yes, it's time for taxidermy table settings. Hope you brought your sense of humour and a strong stomach. You walk into a drawing room and freeze. Something is off. The tea service is laid out perfectly. Silver tray, clinking porcelain cups, cucumber sandwiches stacked with surgical precision. But seated around the miniature table are a group of squirrels, posed stiffly upright in Victorian finery. One wears a waistcoat and monocle, holding a pocket watch. Another clutches a tiny teacup with both paws. A third has its paws delicately arranged around a sewing needle and thimble, as if mid-stitch. All of them are dead. All of them are taxidermied, and none of them look even a little bit sorry about it. Welcome to the Victorian taxidermy tea party, where whimsy and horror have a polite little handshake under the tablecloth. This wasn't just some oddball collector's hobby, it was a trend, a full-blown, respectable artistic and social phenomenon. Imagine your most eccentric aunt crossed with Dr. Frankenstein, add a bit of macabre domestic flair, and you've got the vibe. Victorian England had a deep, complicated love affair with death. But not just human death, animal death too. Especially small animals that could be posed in hilariously human situations. Taxidermy in general wasn't new, but the Victorians elevated it into high-concept art and, in many cases, full-blown comedy. Enter the work of Walter Potter, the grandmaster of this particular flavour of chaos. Potter was a self-taught taxidermist whose crowning achievement was an elaborate series of dioramas featuring animals doing human things. His most famous? The Kitten's Wedding, a scene involving over 20 dead kittens dressed in tailored silk, standing before a tiny altar with velvet cushions, floral garlands, and full miniature wedding attire. There was even a best man and a maid of honour. You can't make this up. Except he did, out of real animals. These were not grotesque horror pieces. In fact, Victorians found them delightful. Children were brought to see them as entertainment. They were displayed in museums, galleries, and in the parlours of the fabulously weird and wealthy. If you had a bit of money and no fear of being haunted by woodland spirits, you could commission your own. And oh, the variety! There were hamsters playing cricket, mice attending school, rabbits in full military dress marching across tiny battlegrounds, frogs posed mid-waltz in little ballroom scenes. You half expect to find a weasel serving canapes and a hedgehog waiting for its turn at charades. What drove this obsession? Some historians point to the Victorian fascination with natural history and Darwin's theory of evolution, which turned animals into a kind of cultural mirror. If humans were just a few rungs up from rodents, why not dress those rodents in bonnets and make them take afternoon tea? Others suggest it was a coping mechanism, at a time when death was ever present, when most children had lost a sibling and every adult had buried someone they loved. Taxidermy was a way to preserve and domesticate mortality, to laugh at it, to shrink it down and give it a top hat. Of course, not everyone was on board. Even then, critics found it morbid, tasteless, or just plain insane. The ethics were hazy. Were the animals killed specifically for the art? Sometimes yes. Sometimes they were found dead. Other times it's unclear. Potter always claimed he used animals that had died naturally or accidentally. But let's be honest, there's only so many kittens dying of natural causes in silk wedding dresses. Here's a fringe fact to make your stomach twist. Some taxidermy artists actually specialised in preserving people's pets. A child's favourite bunny, A beloved calipo, stuffed and posed just as they were in life, sometimes curled peacefully on a cushion, other times posed upright as if still ready for play. Imagine walking into a nursery and finding Mr. Snuffles eternally mid-hop, glass eyes staring into the void. Sweet dreams, little Emily. Modern scholars debate whether this was art, science, or just deeply repressed psychological trauma dressed in lace. Some frame it as early surrealism, a form of imaginative play that let people explore the boundaries between life and death, nature and culture. Others say it was just an elaborate distraction from grief, one that sidestepped emotional pain with twee absurdity. And today, you try hosting a tea party where every guest is a dead rodent in a waistcoat and see how fast someone calls animal welfare. Taxidermy still exists, sure, but there are laws, ethics boards, permits. You can't just pop down to the park, scoop up a dead squirrel and start gluing a top hat to its head. Not legally, anyway. In fact, the modern taxidermy world is split on Victorian-style anthropomorphic displays. Some view it as charming nostalgia. Others see it as grotesque and disrespectful. Museums that house original Walter Potter displays now do so under careful curatorial framing. Part art, part history, part, please don't try this at home. And yet, there's still something undeniably captivating about it. The juxtaposition of death and cuteness, the way these scenes blend horror and humour into something uniquely Victorian. They didn't just want to understand nature, they wanted to civilise it. To shrink it down, dress it up and make it pour the tea. You step back from the table, locking eyes with the monocled squirrel who seems to regard you with eternal judgment. The cup in his paw never shakes. He is dead. He is dapper. He is the Victorian ideal. But don't worry, your next stop is much more mainstream. All you'll need is a penny, an open mind and a tolerance for violence. You're heading into the world of Victorian pulp fiction, where gory stories and evil spirits fill the pages of the beloved, scandalous and deeply inappropriate penny dreadfuls. You're huddled under a gas lamp at the corner of a narrow London alley, fog curling around your ankles like a nosy cat. Somewhere in the distance a horse-drawn carriage clatters past, and a newsboy is shouting headlines about another throat-slashed body found near the docks. In your hands is a thin, grimy pamphlet. 8 pages, cheap paper, smeared ink, the title screaming in Gothic fonts, The Severed Hand of Dr. Bleakmore. You flip to the first page and just like that you're hooked. Blood, revenge, ghosts, possibly someone being pushed into a vat of boiling tar. Welcome to the world of penny dreadfuls, the Victorian version of binge-worthy horror. Cheap, graphic and wildly popular. These weren't highbrow literature. Oh no, if Charles Dickens was the carefully aged wine of Victorian reading, penny dreadfuls were a pint of suspicious alleyway gin, likely made in a bathtub and laced with the questionable substances. And kids couldn't get enough of them. Named for their price, a single penny per issue, these little booklets exploded in popularity in the mid-19th century, filling the streets, homes and imaginations of young readers with stories of highwaymen, murderers, supernatural beings, and enough gothic melodrama to make today's horror movies seem downright subtle. Each instalment ended with a cliffhanger, practically forcing readers to come back the next week with another coin clutched in their soot-streaked fingers. And what wasn't in these things? There were bloodthirsty barons, seductive vampires, haunted dolls, demonic monks, cursed rings, and criminals so depraved they made Jack the Ripper look like a misbehaving hall monitor. A favourite recurring theme? Innocent orphans, uncovering sinister plots while being chased by knife-wielding lunatics. Classic. One particularly infamous story, Varney the Vampire, ran for over 200 issues and essentially invented the tragic, brooding vampire archetype decades before Dracula. Varney was tall, pale, emotionally tortured and, in true Victorian fashion, prone to dramatic monologues. Think less Twilight and more Twilight if Edward routinely threw people off balconies while weeping about the moon. And then there was Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, who slit the throats of his clients and sent their corpses down a chute to be baked into pies by his accomplice. Before the musical, before Johnny Depp, this guy was serving up murder pastries in cheap cereal form to an audience of gleefully horrified readers. People loved it. Penny dreadfuls were printed on the cheapest possible paper and illustrated with inky, high-drama drawings full of bulging eyes, twisted knives and women in various stages of being menaced by supernatural forces or unscrupulous landlords. The covers alone were often worth the price, part tabloid, part nightmare fuel, but despite their graphic content, penny dreadfuls weren't illegal. In fact, they were sold openly everywhere, newsstands, bookshops, market stalls, and while adults certainly read them, they were especially popular among working-class boys. For many, this was their only access to storytelling, especially in homes with no books, no time, and no money for schooling, which leads us to a delightful little fringe fact. Victorian schools and churches tried to ban them. Clergymen warned of the moral rot such stories would cause. Teachers confiscated copies from students and replaced them with wholesome tales of obedient children and the occasional well-behaved squirrel. It didn't matter. Kids found ways. They traded them in alleys, hid them under floorboards, read them by candlelight with wide eyes and growing vocabularies that included words like throat-slitting and phantasm. And the moral panic wasn't limited to literature. Some adults genuinely believed that penny dreadfuls were creating criminals, that boys who read about highwaymen would become highwaymen, that stories of blood and guts would awaken something evil in otherwise docile chimney sweeps. One particularly breathless editorial claimed that no boy can read these pages without his soul being stained, as if little Alfie from Brixton was one werewolf tale away from joining a murder cult. Modern scholars have debated this pearl-clutching for years. Some argue that these stories provided a valuable outlet for working-class imagination. Power fantasies in which poor kids could envision themselves as heroes, avengers, or even villains with control over their own narratives. Others agree with the Victorians. Maybe giving children a steady diet of horror and crime wasn't the healthiest idea, especially when those same children were already dealing with child labour, disease, and sewage adventures. But the penny dreadfuls endured. They evolved. Some morphed into more polished weekly journals, like the Boy's Own Paper, which tried to balance adventure with moral lessons. Others were replaced by pulp novels in the early 20th century. But the DNA of these stories, serialised thrills, cliffhangers, underdog heroes, and sensational gore, lives on in comic books, TV dramas, even Netflix originals. Try launching a children's publication today called The Haunted Slaughterhouse of Craven Moor, and see how fast the Parent-Teacher Association sends a letter to your door. Children's media now comes with age ratings, content warnings, and sensitivity readers. Imagine handing a second grader a graphic novella about a possessed chimney sweep who murders tax collectors under the light of a cursed moon. Arrests might be made, Twitter threads would rage, think pieces would be born. And yet the spirit of the penny dreadful is still very much with us. Every time a true crime podcast goes viral, every time a tween devours a dystopian trilogy full of teenagers stabbing each other in the name of revolution, every time someone binge-watches a show that ends each episode with a gasp and a twist, it's the same impulse, the same thrill. We never really lost it. So as you fold your pamphlet and tuck it into your coat, eyes still wide from the last page twist where it turns out Dr. Bleakmore's hand is still alive, you realise something important. Victorian kids weren't gentle. They weren't protected. They weren't even really children by our standards. They were scrappy little survivors, starved for escape and willing to find it between the bloody, ink-stained pages of a weekly nightmare. Now toss your penny on the vendor's tray because we're heading from fantasy horror into real-life duels, complete with pistols, honour, and the occasional tipsy shootout at dawn. It's still dark when you arrive at the edge of a misty field, your breath puffing in little clouds as the early morning chill seeps through your coat. Two men stand about 20 paces apart, each holding a pistol. Their seconds, a best friend, a cousin, or maybe just someone who owed them a favour, fidget nearby with tense expressions and pocket watches. The silence is thick with nerves and resentment. You hear a final whispered count. 1, 2, 3. Both men raise their weapons. One fires slightly too soon. The other squeezes the trigger, eyes narrowed. Smoke, a crack, and suddenly someone's limping or bleeding, or sprawled on the frozen grass, wondering if dying dramatically was worth the trouble. Congratulations, you've just witnessed a Victorian duel where disputes weren't settled with lawsuits or angry Yelp reviews, but with loaded firearms, frilly shirts, and an alarming amount of arrogance. By the mid-19th century, duelling was technically illegal in Britain. Technically. That didn't stop people, especially gentlemen who felt their honour had been dinged by some stray insult, offhand remark or snide comment about the tightness of their cravat. Dueling was the last gasp of a dying chivalric code, a dramatic holdover from an earlier era that refused to go quietly into the night. These weren't the Wild West standoffs you might picture. There was etiquette. Dueling was bound by elaborate rules known as codes duello. A proper duel required formal letters of challenge, witnesses, chosen weapons, usually pistols, sometimes swords, and the all-important seconds, whose job was not just to assist but ideally to de-escalate things before anyone actually died. Of course, things did get deadly. Duels might start over a gambling insult, a jealous glance at someone's wife, or even, fringe horror fact alert, a dispute over punctuation in a published essay. Yes, someone once challenged another man to a duel because of a comma. If you've ever raged at your co-worker's misuse of a semicolon, just be glad you weren't a Victorian academic with access to firearms. And here's the wildest twist. Many duels weren't about real anger. They were performative. The goal wasn't always to kill, just to show up. To prove you were brave, respectable, a man of honour, which in practice meant willing to risk death over literally anything. Sometimes both parties would film into the air. Other times they'd intentionally miss, declare satisfaction and walk away. It was ritualised male peacocking, but with a blood potential. But don't assume this was limited to hot-headed aristocrats. Duels happened across social classes, between army officers, artists, even doctors. One famous duel involved Prime Minister Wellington, who faced off against a fellow member of Parliament. Yes, the actual head of government got up at dawn and pointed a pistol at a political rival. The duel was never officially punished, and neither man was injured. But still, it happened. Imagine your current head of state resolving disputes with pistols and powdered wigs instead of press conferences. Still, as time wore on, public opinion shifted. Newspapers began mocking duelists instead of romanticising them. Clergy condemned the practice more loudly. Some high-profile duels ended in tragic or ridiculous ways. One man accidentally shot his own foot, another hit a passing bird instead of his opponent, and the public grew tired of watching grown men throw tantrums with pistols. One particular duel stands out. The 1840 affair between two Frenchmen in Paris who, after a disagreement over whose ballooning skills were superior, decided to duel in hot air balloons. They each lifted off with a second and pistols in hand. At 900 feet, one balloon fired first and hit the other's envelope, causing it to plummet. Both men aboard died. The winner floated down in silent, victorious awkwardness. If that isn't the most over-the-top Victorian flex in history, nothing is. Scholars today debate whether dueling was truly about honour or just an outdated form of macho spectacle. Some argue it was a safety valve, a way to channel violent impulses into structured rituals with clear rules. Others believe it reflected a deeply toxic culture of pride, insecurity and social performance, especially among the upper classes. It wasn't justice, it was vanity with gunpowder. And yes, there were drunk duels too. Men would drink heavily the night before or during, and sometimes forgot entirely what the original offence was. Wait, why are we shooting each other again? Something about your horse blocking my view at the opera. Ah, well, fire on 3 then. You may be wondering what would happen if you tried this today. The short answer, jail, possibly a feature on Dateline. In most countries, dueling is classified under attempted murder or illegal discharge of a firearm. Even if no one's hit, the act of challenging someone to a gunfight over an insult is frowned upon by modern legal systems and ethics boards, and pretty much everyone except a few niche corners of the internet. You could, in theory, still challenge someone to a verbal duel, say a roast battle or an impromptu dance-off, but the moment weapons enter the picture, you're trading your honour for handcuffs. Still, the romantic myth of the duel persists in pop culture. In novels, films and even cartoons, there's something weirdly compelling about two men settling their grievances with flintlocks at dawn. It's absurd, it's theatrical, it's deadly, it's very, very Victorian. So as the smoke clears and one duelist limps away with a bruised shoulder and slightly less honour, you're reminded that this was how grievances got resolved in an era obsessed with decorum and destruction. Because nothing says civil society like a hangover duel in a waistcoat. Next up though, things get even stranger. Forget honour. What if you could just trade your wife like a prize cow at the local market? Dust off your coin purse because wife selling is officially on the docket. You're standing in the middle of a bustling market. Stalls piled high with onions, bolts of scratchy fabric, wheels of suspiciously smelly cheese. But you're not here for produce. No, Your attention is fixed on the wooden platform near the cattle pens, where a man in a tattered coat is holding a rope tied firmly around the wrist of a middle-aged woman. She looks equal parts annoyed and indifferent. He clears his throat and shouts, "Here she is! Good worker, clean house, decent stew, doesn't snore." The crowd laughs. The woman adjusts her bonnet. This is not a kidnapping. This is a wife sale, a perfectly ordinary if deeply bizarre Victorian method of marital separation that looks suspiciously like livestock auctioning with slightly more lace. Yes, wife selling was a thing, not a metaphor, not a joke. A literal sale of a spouse in a public setting, often conducted with the same tone as selling a sheep, loudly, casually, and with some light haggling. And while it wasn't legally sanctioned, it was so widely practiced that it had its own rituals, slang, and, occasionally, souvenir etchings. Here's how it worked. A man, dissatisfied with his marriage and unable or unwilling to pursue a formal and expensive divorce, would announce his intent to sell his wife. They'd go to a market or fairground, usually leading the woman by a halter, rope, or sometimes a ribbon. The sale would be declared publicly, and bids could come in from any interested parties, sometimes strangers, sometimes friends, and occasionally even the wife's lover, who was essentially buying her officially to avoid scandal. And once the deal was struck, the man would often declare something along the lines of, "She's yours now, good riddance." And that was that. It sounds barbaric, and in many ways it was. But here's the thing that twists the narrative. Many of the women consented. In fact, some orchestrated it. For working-class couples, where divorce was prohibitively expensive, only attainable via an Act of Parliament until 1857, this weird little loophole functioned as a kind of social workaround. If a marriage was miserable, and both parties wanted out, selling the wife, complete with witnesses and community acknowledgement, served as a makeshift, pseudo-legal separation. No courts, no paperwork, just a rope, a crowd, and an unspoken agreement not to ask too many questions. Still, let's not romanticize it. Not every wife sale was mutual. Some women were humiliated, dragged through markets against their will, treated as property in the most literal sense. The practice revealed just how few rights women had, how easily they could be discarded, commodified, reassigned. It wasn't funny for everyone. It was often a last resort, or worse, an act of cruelty wrapped in the excuse of tradition. Here's your fringe fact for the night. In some communities, wife sales came with a receipt. A handwritten note, sometimes signed by witnesses, that said something along the lines of, "I hereby transfer my wife, Margaret, to Mr. Thomas Bell for the agreed sum of 5 shillings and a pint of cider." These scraps of paper became unspoken contracts, rarely legally binding but often honoured by the community, because nothing says legitimate transaction like cider-fueled paperwork, and that they weren't even always cheap. Prices ranged from a few pence to several pounds, depending on the woman's age, appearance, reputation, or even her cooking skills. Some men even sweetened the deal by throwing in household items like a tea kettle or a goat. Others made emotional appeals. "She's a fine woman, I'm just not fine enough for her." It's not Shakespeare, but it's weirdly poetic. But perhaps the most mind-bending part? The authorities usually turned a blind eye. Unless someone made a scene or started throwing punches, magistrates often ignored wife sales entirely. They were treated as unofficial agreements, like a community handshake between two guys who didn't want to deal with paperwork. Even newspapers reported them with a kind of dry amusement, listing them alongside farm reports and obituaries. That said, by the late 19th century the tide was turning. Divorce laws began to relax, if only slightly, and the rise of women's rights movements made the entire spectacle look increasingly cruel and outdated. Reformers and middle-class moralists found the whole thing appalling. Selling your wife in a public auction. It didn't just seem primitive, it seemed like something England should have been too civilized for. Embarrassing. Scholars have chewed on this practice for years, debating its meaning. Was it a vulgar exploitation of women's powerlessness? Yes. Was it also a strange form of grassroots problem-solving in a society that gave poor people no legal options? Also yes. Like many Victorian traditions, it was both grotesque and ingenious, a survival tactic born from a rigid system that punished the poor for wanting autonomy. Now try this today. Imagine listing your spouse on Craigslist. Mildly sarcastic, good with cats, yours for a fair trade. The divorce courts would descend, social media would explode about it, you'd be trending for all the wrong reasons. In modern law, you can't sell a person under any circumstance. Not your wife, not your husband. Not even that guy who keeps leaving dishes in the sink. Not unless you're looking for a serious prison sentence and an excruciating press tour. But back in Victorian England, it was just something that happened. Market day. Cheese wheels, used boots, and oh yes, Margaret. Now available for sixpence and a smile. So you walk away from the auction, slightly dazed, with the sound of bartering voices fading behind you. It's not the last time you'll see animals, people, and social order thrown together in a blender, though. Because coming up next, we head to the ring, where monkeys fight dogs and no one seems to question it. Get ready for the most horrifying circus act yet. You push through a crowd thick with cigar smoke, beer breath, and the sharp tang of unwashed wool coats. The wooden bleachers creak under the weight of dozens of spectators shouting over each other, waving coin-filled fists and placing sweaty bets with a man in a bowler hat and a ledger stained with ale. In the centre of the pit, an actual pit, ringed by a low wooden fence and slick with sawdust and spit, stands a small nervous-looking monkey. Across from it, a snarling terrier, teeth bared, tail twitching. The crowd goes wild. This isn't a joke. This is the main event. You've just arrived at a Victorian animal fight, and tonight's feature, monkey versus dog. Welcome to the darkest corner of entertainment. Before you can even process how wrong this is, a bell rings. Just one sharp clang and the fight begins. The monkey shrieks, lunges, and sinks its tiny fingers into the terrier's fur. The dog snaps back, teeth flashing. Blood's drawn quickly, and the audience loves it. You wince, but around you people cheer like it's the finals at Wimbledon. You're in a world where animals are weapons and cruelty is a casual weekend thrill. Victorian England, for all its lace and tea time rituals, was deeply obsessed with blood sports, and not just between humans. From cockfights and rat baiting to bear baiting and yes, simian cage matches, the spectacle of animals fighting to the death was considered not only thrilling but often completely acceptable. These events were held in pubs, private yards, old theatres and back alleys. No velvet curtains here, just beer, bets and brutality. Let's talk about ratting, the Victorian pub sport of choice. A pit would be filled with dozens of rats, sometimes 100 or more. An especially trained dog, usually a terrier, would be timed on how fast it could kill them. The audience would roar encouragement, placing bets on whether the dog could break a certain kills per minute record. One legendary dog, Billy the Rat Killer, was said to have dispatched 100 rats in under 6 minutes. He was practically a celebrity, immortalised in oil paintings and mentioned in early sports journals. Yes, sports journals. But monkey fights added a new layer of cruelty. Monkeys, unlike rats, could be trained to fight like tiny gladiators. In some cases, they were outfitted with little swords, or even sharpened sticks, and trained to jab or scratch at their opponent, usually a dog. If that sounds absurdly theatrical, it was, but it also sold tickets. The unpredictability of a monkey combined with its dexterity made the fights longer, more chaotic, and in the eyes of the crowd funnier, which somehow makes it even worse. Here's your fringe fact. In some venues, fights were narrated, yes, narrated, by a designated showman who gave the animals voices, as if it were a comedy sketch. "The monkey says not today, Rover," he'd shout while the poor creature tried to avoid being mauled. People laughed, they jeered, they drank, and the monkey bled. Why was this considered entertainment? That's the great Victorian paradox. In an era of supposed refinement, of etiquette guides, moral instruction, and pearl clutching over piano legs being too shapely, you also had crowds roaring with glee as two animals tore each other apart. And it wasn't just the lower classes. Middle-class gentlemen attended, respectable business owners, even a few lawmakers, their top hats tilted just so, coins changing hands discreetly behind their backs. Scholars have argued that these animal fights were a form of stress relief, an outlet for the pent-up frustrations of rigid Victorian life. Others say it was about control. In a society where the average person felt increasingly powerless under industrial systems and class hierarchies, watching something Victorian win or lose on command gave people a cheap, brutal sense of power. Animal welfare laws did exist by the mid-1800s. The Cruelty to Animals Act of 1835 made blood sports technically illegal, but enforcement was laughable. Police rarely raided these events unless someone tipped them off, and even then, organisers would bribe officials or simply relocate to another basement or barn. Punishments, when they happened, were small fines or mild embarrassment. No one was losing sleep over it, except, presumably, the animals. And if you think this is just another dusty footnote in history, consider this. Animal fighting still exists today, albeit underground. Dogfighting rings are discovered every year, and while monkey versus dog no longer sells out pubs in London, echoes of that appetite for violence dressed as spectacle are still with us. In certain sports, in certain internet videos, in the casual cruelty people find hilarious until someone points out the blood. Now imagine trying this today. Announce a public dog versus monkey fight on social media. See what happens. Animal rights activists would descend with lawsuits, petitions, and flamethrower energy. Authorities would arrive within hours. You'd be fined, arrested, and probably do time. Your name would be permanently synonymous with sociopathy, and rightly so. In fact, modern animal cruelty laws are some of the strictest on the books. The idea of not just harming animals, but monetizing that harm for fun is an instant deal-breaker for society. No exceptions, no nostalgia, no, but it's tradition, it's abuse, period. And yet, in Victorian times, it was just another night out. Something to do after work, a laugh, a bet, a distraction from the stride of factory whistles and social stagnation. And in that way, it's a mirror. Ugly, cracked, but reflective. Of what people will watch, what they'll accept, what they'll pay for, if no one's looking too closely. You step back from the pit as the monkey retreats, limping and screeching, the dog foaming at the mouth, victorious for now. The crowd roars, coins are exchanged, pints refilled, and you realise this isn't a one-time event, it's a schedule. So maybe it's time to take a break from blood sport. Don't worry, the next thrill is more aerodynamic. Grab your top hat and hold on tight, we're hopping on top of a moving train just for kicks. The whistle screams, steam hisses. The iron monster lurches forward with a groan, and you grab the edge of a railcar and haul yourself up, coat flapping, heart hammering, boots slipping slightly on the dew-slick metal. You climb, not inside, but on top. That's right. You are now riding the express to Birmingham on the roof of a moving Victorian train. No ticket, no seat, just your questionable life choices and a top hat that's probably about to fly off. Welcome to Train Surfing Victorian Edition. If you thought adrenaline was a modern addiction, think again. As soon as locomotives began thundering across the countryside in the early 1800s, people started thinking, how can we make this faster and preferably more illegal? By mid-century, thrill-seekers and desperate travellers alike had turned the tops, sides and even the undersides of train cars into their own personal racetracks, commuter shortcuts and public stunts. For some it was necessity, for others it was sport. Either way, it was dangerous, stupidly impressive, and, depending on who you asked, mildly heroic or wildly idiotic. You're crouching now, the wind screaming past your ears, soot speckling your cheeks, the countryside blurring beneath you. You grip the edge of the carriage roof with frozen fingers, hat gone, dignity hanging on by a thread. A fellow roof rider a few feet away lights a cigarette like it's just another Tuesday. He gives you a nod. You try to return it, but a rogue gust nearly tosses you into a hedgerow. This wasn't just some one-off daredevil behaviour. In the Victorian era, roof riding, also known as car surfing or riding the drag, was surprisingly common, especially among young men, poor workers, or stowaways. If you couldn't afford a ticket, or if you wanted to avoid checkpoints, or if you simply got a kick out of taunting death every other second, the roof was the place to be. Some did it to get to work, others did it to impress friends. A few were just testing the laws of physics and social sanity at the same time, and it wasn't just passengers doing the surfing. Railway workers sometimes had to climb across the tops of moving trains to check brakes or fix issues between cars in motion. Imagine being asked to balance on a seesawing slab of iron while racing along at 40 miles an hour, all for the privilege of earning just enough to afford gruel and maybe one night a week in a dry bed. Let's not forget the train hoppers, drifters, runaways, and itinerant workers who'd leap aboard freight trains in hopes of finding work or escaping it. They clung to side ladders curled between coal bins, or found a spot on the roof and prayed it wouldn't rain, or tunnel, or suddenly decapitate them. Fringe fact time, some daring individuals, usually young men with more nerve than sense, would actually race the trains by leaping from car to car like it was a game. There were even betting rings surrounding who could go the farthest without slipping. In one documented case, a teenager tried to sprint across the length of a train during a countryside stretch and made it 14 cars before a low-hanging tree ended his career. And his teeth. Of course, this kind of stunt wasn't universally admired. Railway companies were furious, not because of the danger. Victorians tolerated a lot of public death, but because it disrupted the schedule. Timetables were everything. If a train had to stop to scrape some kid off a bridge or remove a stowaway, it cost them money, and that was unacceptable. So they started posting guards. Fines were introduced, arrests were made. Did it stop the practice? Not even a little. And yes, you guessed it. Scholars have found reasons to argue about all this. Some view train surfing as a working-class rebellion, a way to access freedom and a movement otherwise denied by cost and class. Trains were the future, after all, the ultimate symbol of modern progress. And riding them for free, even on top, was like thumbing your nose at the machine. Others say it was just youthful recklessness, plain and simple. A thrill in a world with few safe outlets for risk. What makes it especially Victorian is the sheer style involved. Roof riders weren't always ragged. Some wore suits, top hats, and even pocket watches, clinging to chimney vents while checking the time. There's a famous woodcut from the 1860s depicting a man in full morning dress, briefcase tucked under one arm, crouched between two rooftop brake boxes, presumably on his way to a meeting or a duel. Imagine doing this today. You hop on the 6:45 commuter train and, instead of boarding through the door like a rational adult, you scale it. Crawl up the back, wave to the shocked passengers inside, and plop yourself down on the roof. Your commute now includes low bridges, high winds, and a 100% chance of felony trespassing. Transit police would tackle you before you even reach the first overpass. TikTok might give you 15 minutes of fame, but jail would give you 3 to 5 years. And yet, there's something undeniably exhilarating about it. The wind in your hair, if it doesn't rip it out, the vibration of the tracks, the complete abandonment of safety and decorum in favour of sheer, unfiltered freedom. It's like the Victorian version of skateboarding off a skyscraper. Ridiculous, unnecessary, and kind of legendary. So you crouch lower as the train begins to curve, clutching the riveted roof like it's the only thing keeping you alive, which it is. The countryside whips past in a blur of hedges, fields, and startled sheep, and you realise this isn't just transportation, it's rebellion. Against rules, against gravity, against the dull crawl of respectability. But don't get too comfortable, because your next stop isn't quite so fast-paced. In fact, it's slow, squishy, and happens on top of a sticky pub table. Get ready for the high-stakes, low-speed drama of Victorian maggot racing. You step into a cramped Victorian pub, ducking under a beam blackened by pipe smoke and centuries of spilt ale. The air is the thick soup of stale beer, wet wool, and the vague suggestion of someone's unwashed dog. Around you, the usual suspects. Ruddy-faced men hollering over each other, a barmaid with forearms like fence posts, and somewhere in the back a fiddler soaring away at a tune that might once have been a waltz but now sounds like a catfight in musical form. But you're not here for the ambience. You're here for the maggot racing, and the evening's main event is about to begin. Yes, maggot racing. You shuffle over to the long table near the hearth where a rowdy crowd has gathered, half pints sloshing dangerously close to the action. The table is cleared, save for a chalked-in racetrack, 2 feet long if that, drawn straight down the middle of the sticky wood surface. At one end, a row of maggots, fat and glistening, twitch in tiny, aimless anticipation. At the other end, the promise of nothing, because maggots are deeply unmotivated creatures and also can't read finish lines. And yet the excitement is palpable. Each maggot has a name, because of course they do. There's Slim Jim, Queen Vicky, Churchillian Crawley, and someone's personal favourite, Sir Squirmalot. Bets are being placed, coins rattling onto the bar as shouts erupt. 2 shillings on that pale one. The curly one's got legs, I can feel it. Someone's made a sign out of a coaster that reads Go Go Gutsy. At the centre of the table, a self-appointed referee, wearing a waistcoat far too tight for comfort, raises a hand. On my mark, he slurs. Clearly several drinks in, release your champions. The maggots are placed at the starting line with spoons, fingers, or in one case, very carefully poured from a matchbox. The crowd leans in, breath is held. And then, they're off. Except not really. One moves half a centimetre, another curls into a ball and gives up on life entirely. A third flips over onto its back and just lies there like it's contemplating taxes. The cheers turn to jeers, then laughter. Someone starts chanting Go Slim Jim like it's the Grand National. This, believe it or not, was a real pub game, and not just in one place. In pubs across Britain, particularly in more rural or working class towns, maggot racing was a semi-regular form of amusement. It was cheap, required zero skill, and provided endless opportunities for shouting, wagering and ridicule. Exactly the kind of low-stakes chaos the average labourer needed after a long day crawling around under industrial machinery. And lest you think this was just the desperate entertainment of drunk farmers, let it be known that maggot racing occasionally attracted press coverage. Local papers would write up the winners, champions were celebrated, especially if the maggot was lucky enough to win more than once. In such cases, the maggot might be given a name, retired from competition, and possibly mounted in some deeply morbid form of pub honour. Yes, some pubs had little glass cases for their champion bugs. Shrines to wormy glory. Of course, maggots weren't the only participants in these micro-Olympics. Snail racing, slug wrangling, and even earwig jousting, you heard me, made appearances at Victorian pubs. The goal was never really to win. It was to yell, to bet, to forget for a few glorious minutes that your boots were full of sewage and your landlord had doubled the rent again. Here's a lesser-known fact. In some parts of England, professional maggot trainers existed. That's a generous term, of course. They didn't have tiny dumbbells or racetracks at home. But some folks swore that feeding their maggots certain types of meat or exposing them to warmth made them faster. Others believed in whispering techniques, in which competitors would literally talk to their maggots before a race, not yell, whisper, as if trying to seduce speed out of a lava. One regular named Percy claimed his maggots responded best to hymn recitations. We don't judge. Naturally, Victorian moralists were deeply offended by all of this, not just by the gambling and shouting, but by the general pointlessness of it. Publicans were occasionally fined for promoting disorderly games, especially if too much money was changing hands or someone got into a brawl over a cheating maggot. And yes, cheating was a thing. Competitors were caught pre-warming their bugs, slipping droplets of beer to rivals' maggots to slow them down, or even swapping in fresher, more wriggly ringers at the last second. Scholars have scratched their heads over these micro-contests. Some see them as symbolic rebellions against industrialization. In a world increasingly run by steam, steel and schedules, there was something gloriously defiant about betting serious money on an insect that might not even move. Others see it as social glue, low-effort games that gave communities something to do together besides drink and complain about the cost of bread. And try pulling this off today. Walk into your local pub, dump a handful of maggots onto a table and declare a race. Watch the bartender have a slow, nervous breakdown. Health codes would be shattered. Animal rights activists might show up, not because maggots are protected, but because it's just disgusting. Social media would get involved. You'd go viral, but not in a good way. Yet as you watch Sir Squirmelot finally twitch across the finish line, a sticky beer ring someone's designated with a coin, you realise something. The Victorians didn't need Netflix. They had grub-based gambling and enough spare time to cheer on the world's least enthusiastic athletes. The room erupts, coins fly, someone lifts a maggot aloft on a teaspoon like a tiny war hero. To the victor, they shout, toasting the bug, and to the next round. Because naturally there's always another race, always another worm, always another excuse to laugh too loud in a crumbling building where no one's washed the floor since 1832. But now, it's time to leave the slow lane behind. Next, you'll attend the kind of party that literally glows with radiation. That's right. We're heading into the eerily cheerful world of Victorian X-ray parties, where science and reckless exposure collide. You walk into a parlour expecting polite conversation and perhaps a bit of piano music, but instead you're greeted by a glowing, humming contraption the size of a tea cart, crackling quietly like a storm waiting to happen. Everyone's gathered around it, sipping sherry and giggling like schoolchildren. One man is holding his hand under a glass plate while a strange machine whirs beside him. "Look," someone exclaims, "you can see his bones." The room gasps. A woman claps. Welcome to the bizarre world of the Victorian X-ray party, where science, fashion, and a complete disregard for radiation safety collided in one glowing mess of curiosity. Yes, this was a real thing. The moment X-rays were discovered in 1895 by Wilhelm Röntgen, the Victorian public lost its mind. Within months, X-ray machines were being built, bought, borrowed and bootstrapped together in backrooms, parlours and amateur labs. Scientific journals hadn't even finished printing diagrams when the upper and middle classes turned it into an evening's amusement. At these parties, guests would line up to have their hands, feet or even skulls X-rayed. The images, called shadographs, were ghostly, skeletal silhouettes of bone and ring and buckle. It was magic and also mildly horrifying. Women gasped at the sight of their finger bones. Men laughed nervously at the realization that under all those fine coats and waistcoats, they were walking skeletons too. It was the ultimate parlour trick, technology that peeled back your skin while you sipped tea. Some party hosts went all in. Invitations were handwritten on faux medical paper. Rooms were decorated like laboratories, complete with bubbling flasks and anatomically themed table settings. Guests were asked to remove their gloves. Only their gloves calmed down, and volunteers would be invited to see themselves within. It was half science demo, half seance, and everyone wanted a turn. And of course, this was before anyone understood what radiation actually did. The early machines used for these demonstrations didn't have shielding, safety timers, or dose meters. They just sat in the corner of the room, hissing and glowing like a friendly little death machine. The longer the exposure, the better the image, so guests would hold still for up to 20 minutes, sometimes longer, with their bones baking under invisible beams of ionizing radiation. And nobody questioned it. Here's your fringe fact of the night. Some enterprising Victorians tried to use X-rays as a beauty treatment. One device promised to remove unsightly facial hair using radiation. Basically, point the machine at your face until the hairs fell out, or your skin did. Others thought X-rays might cure arthritis, gout, or even female hysteria, because of course they did. And the Victorians weren't just exposing their hands. There are documented cases of people scanning entire bodies, often multiple times in one evening. A particularly bold group in London hosted a full exposure night, where partygoers took turns sitting in a special booth, getting scanned head to toe while onlookers murmured appreciatively over how neat their rib cages looked. And then there was the fashion fallout. The X-ray craze made some Victorian women deeply anxious about their undergarments. Suddenly, corsets, especially the steel-boned kind, were no longer just a symbol of feminine virtue. They were visible, through the body. A scandal. Some women reportedly changed to fabric-only corsets just in case someone decided to scan them without warning. X-ray voyeurism became a legitimate concern, particularly in spaces like medical schools and scientific expos, which, yes, brings us to the fact that X-ray peeping was also a thing. Sketchy gents with portable devices, or so they claimed, threatened to X-ray women in public, especially at beaches or train stations. Rumours spread of men using machines to see beneath skirts. It probably didn't happen often, if ever, but the fear was enough to spark one of the first moral panics about invasive tech. So what were the scholars of the time saying? Well, some were thrilled. They saw X-rays as proof of mankind's unstoppable march toward enlightenment. The Royal Society published breathless papers. Medical professionals imagined a future without exploratory surgery. But others, doctors mostly, began to whisper warnings. Reports trickled in about burns, sores and fatigue in frequent users. Technicians began losing hair, teeth fell out. One poor fellow developed lesions on his hands, but kept demonstrating the machine anyway, because dedication to science, or just denial, is eternal. Eventually the tide turned. As radiation sickness became harder to ignore, X-ray machines were pulled out of parlours and tucked firmly back into hospitals. Regulations followed, slow, broken at first, then all at once. By the early 20th century, X-ray use was limited to medical settings with somewhat safer protocols. The days of glowing parties with finger bones and cocktails were over. Today, throw at a party where guests take turns irradiating themselves for laughs, and you're looking at multiple lawsuits, revoked licenses, and a health department intervention. X-ray machines are now locked behind lead-lined walls, operated by trained professionals in hazard suits, and flanked by warning signs the size of tombstones. "Do not stand here" is the new party slogan. And yet the echoes remain. We still love novelty tech. We still gather to marvel at the weirdness of our own anatomy. And every time someone in a white coat wheels out a portable scanner at an airport or a dentist's office, we nod like it's perfectly normal, forgetting that 100 years ago, someone would have thrown a soiree over the very same thing. As you leave the glowing room, your skin prickling with a little too much. Something, you pass guests laughing and examining their ghostly handprints. No one's worried, no one's wearing gloves. The air smells like sherry and ozone, and no one knows yet that all this fun has a very long, very radioactive hangover. But enough of glowing death traps. Let's return to the quiet, scandalous realm of the human body, specifically ankles. Get ready for a deep dive into how showing just a bit of calf could ruin your entire Victorian reputation. You're walking down a London street, minding your own business, when suddenly the man beside you gasps, drops his hat and points like he's just seen the second coming. You follow his gaze. There, on the far side of the walkway, a woman is stepping up into a carriage. And in that brief movement, her long, ruffled skirt lifts just enough to reveal an ankle. One single, stocking-clad, possibly slightly dusty Victorian ankle. The horror. The scandal. Somewhere nearby, a monocle shatters. Welcome to the high-stakes game of Victorian modesty, where exposing even the most innocent portion of leg flesh could spark a public meltdown, destroy a young woman's marriage prospects, or at the very least give a passing gentleman heart palpitations. You've been warned. In this society, a flash of calf is basically softcore smut. Let's unpack this feverish obsession with lower limbs. In Victorian England, a woman's body was not her own. It was a symbol, a statement, a walking billboard for propriety. The upper classes especially lived in a state of constant self-policing, where fashion and modesty worked together, like two stern aunts watching your every move, and nothing drew their ire quite like an accidentally revealed ankle. Women's clothing was specifically designed to keep the body hidden in layers. Petticoats under skirts, under overskirts, under bustles, stockings, boots, gloves, high necklines, and of course long dresses, ankle length, or preferably dragging the floor like you were trying to mop it with your hemline. The idea was to transform the female form into something approximating a respectable floating curtain. Even the furniture played along. In the early part of the century, piano legs were sometimes covered with little fabric skirts to prevent improper thoughts. Yes, piano legs, because apparently, if a man caught sight of both your ankle and the curled foot of a mahogany side table in the same room, it was game over for civilization. Now, to be fair, not everyone was equally unhinged about it. The strictest standards were reserved for young, unmarried women of the middle and upper classes, those whose reputations were considered fragile and constantly at risk of shattering like a teacup with a bad attitude. One wrong glance, one slightly lifted hem during a muddy walk, and rumours would shroud like chimney smoke. Did you see her ankle? Both of them? In daylight? Disgraceful. Here's your fringe fact. Victorian men wrote poetry about ankles. Real, published, borderline erotic poetry praising the curve. The mystery, the soul-stirring wonder of a well-formed ankle. One gentleman described it as the glimpse of paradise beneath silk. Another wrote that a single view of a lady's ankle while she stepped off a carriage was enough to fuel a month's worth of dreams. That's right. Before OnlyFans, there was ankle fandom. But there's a deeper, weirder context here. The Victorian obsession with modesty was not just about control, it was about contradiction. The more something was hidden, the more it became charged. The ankle, unlike, say, the elbow or the earlobe, was forbidden fruit simply because it was always concealed. It became a proxy for sexuality, a symbol of flirtation without saying a word. A well-timed ankle flash could be a Victorian version of a wink, or, if deployed recklessly, a full-blown social grenade. Women weren't stupid. Many of them learned to weaponize this absurdity. A flick of the skirt here, a slightly raised foot while crossing a stream, these tiny rebellions carried meaning. In a society where they were expected to be pure, passive, and constantly pleasant, hinting at forbidden territory without technically violating the rules gave them just the tiniest edge of power. Think of it as modesty chess. Now, of course, not everyone played along. Working-class women, especially those in physically demanding jobs, didn't always have the luxury or the patience for 15 layers of modesty armour. They wore shorter skirts out of necessity, not scandal. But that didn't stop society from judging them. If your ankle showed because you were scrubbing floors, that wasn't cute, that was uncultured. The double standards were thick enough to butter toast with. Even more scandalous was the swimwear. Late-century bathing costumes for women looked more like woolen prison uniforms than anything you'd want to get wet in. They covered you from collarbone to knee, sometimes down to the ankle, complete with stockings, caps, and even weights sewn into the hems so the water wouldn't lift the fabric and expose anything too distracting. Heaven forbid a wave reveal a knee, the sea would never recover. Eventually, as with all ridiculous social codes, cracks began to form. Fashion shifted slowly. Hemlines inched up, corsets loosened. By the turn of the 20th century, women began challenging these norms outright. especially as they entered sports, bicycling and the suffragette movement. Ankles became less sacred and more anatomical. But try this in modern times. Go out in public, dramatically lift your skirt to reveal your ankle and wait for the gasps. Spoiler, you'll get stares, but only because people will think you've either travelled through time or lost a bet. Flashing an ankle today is about as provocative as showing someone your elbow. Modesty has changed, clothing has changed, expectations have mostly evolved. Still, the ankles moment in the scandal spotlight tells us something. It reveals how absurdly fragile Victorian gender politics were, how women's bodies were constantly politicised down to the literal square inch, and how power often lived not in what was seen, but in what was forbidden. So as you step over a puddle with exaggerated care, your skirt lifting just slightly, you feel the full weight of that scandalous history. Once, this simple movement could have sparked whispers, admiration, or even outrage. Now, it might just get you a confused glance and a snort from someone scrolling Instagram. Don't worry, there's more where that came from. Because next, we're heading toward a public event so uncomfortable it makes ankle poetry look subtle. Actual public drownings, where onlookers cheered, gasped, and sometimes bet on who would make it out alive. You're standing on the edge of a riverbank, jostled between women with parasols, dock workers with sausages in their hands, and a couple of bored teenagers flicking stones at ducks. The mood is festive, almost cheerful if a bit damp. There's shouting down by the water, someone's gone in. You squint through the crowd and spot a figure thrashing in the current, their arms slicing the grey water, head bobbing in and out, struggling to stay afloat. A collective gasp rises from the onlookers, and then someone yells, "Here comes the rescue boat!" The crowd leans in. You think you're at some kind of sporting event, but you're not. You're at a public drowning, a real-life spectacle where someone fights for their life, and everyone else just watches. In Victorian England, watching someone drown wasn't just tragedy, it was entertainment. Especially in big cities like London, where the Thames wasn't just a river but a stage. Drownings were frequent, dramatic, and incredibly public. And if the rescue came in time, even better. It meant the audience got a bit of tension, a dramatic climax, and then a satisfying resolution. Like a live-action soap opera only soaked in sewage and moral ambiguity. It's not that people didn't care, it's that they were fascinated. The river was full of secrets and sadness, yes, but also of morbid possibility. A man falling in off a bridge. A woman in petticoats deliberately wading out past her waist. A child slipping from a wharf. The water offered both death and drama, and Victorians, ever obsessed with the line between the two, were drawn to it like moths to a very soggy flame. And the rescue scene was just as ritualised as the drowning. You'd hear shouts, "Boy overboard! She's in the drink!" And within moments crowds would gather. It was common for a rescue boat to already be on hand, especially in areas where accidents and attempted suicide were frequent. These boats weren't official emergency services, mind you. They were usually run by professional rescuers, semi-volunteers who doubled as showmen. They had rowing skills, strong arms, and a nose for when to time the drama just right. A few even had uniforms and capes, because of course they did. Here's your fringe fact. The Royal Humane Society, founded in the 18th century and very active in the 19th, rewarded people for pulling off dramatic rescues. Medals, certificates, and occasionally cash were given to civilians who risked life and limb to save a drowning victim. And yes, some people began staging rescues just to earn a medal or get their name in the paper. Fake drowning, totally a thing. Especially if you had a buddy who could thrash convincingly and then miraculously recover once fished from the water. But of course, not every story ended in applause. Sometimes the rescue was too late. Sometimes there was no rescue at all. Yet people stayed. They watched. They witnessed. Because that's what Victorians did. They bore witness to death as a public experience. If someone was pulled from the water already gone, the body would be laid out on the dock or the bank and the crowd would stand in silence, or murmurs, waiting to see what happened next. It was both gruesome and weirdly reverent. The psychology behind it remains debated. Some scholars argue that public drowning served as a kind of collective reckoning, a way for a population constantly surrounded by death to process it communally. Others argue it was a thrill, plain and simple. People like danger, especially when it's happening to someone else. The unpredictability of water, the possibility of salvation or tragedy, offered a spectacle that was both safe to observe and emotionally potent. And let's not forget, this was a time when suicide was criminal. If you tried to take your own life and survived, you could be arrested, tried, jailed. So the response to jumpers was often laced with judgment, not empathy. Women who waded into the river out of despair might be dragged back, slapped and scolded. Men were sometimes mocked. Spectators didn't always root for survival. Some just showed up to see what happened. In fact, newspapers published drowning schedules. Not officially, of course, but headlines about another leap from Waterloo Bridge or young governess lost to the tide were common. These stories sold copies, and the locations became known. Certain spots along the river were infamous, places where people went to die, and others went to watch them try. The Victorians loved a tragic arc. It was like Shakespeare, but wetter. Now in modern times, even reading about this feels borderline criminal. You see someone in danger and you don't help, that's a lawsuit, a social media dogpile, maybe even a criminal charge depending on the circumstances. Public expectation has shifted so far from passive witness to mandatory responder that not helping isn't just frowned upon, it's often prosecuted, and thankfully so. Can you imagine showing up at a pier with a pint and a sandwich hoping to catch a bit of drowning drama before heading home for supper? You'd be arrested, shamed, banned from polite society, or at the very least blacklisted from your neighbourhood barbecue. But the Victorians were different. Their relationship with mortality was both intimate and theatrical. They lived with death on their streets, in their homes, in their cribs, and sometimes they watched it happen with eyes wide open and hands clasped behind their backs like they were at an art exhibit. And so you step away from the river, still hearing the splash of oars and the faint applause of onlookers. Maybe the person was saved, maybe not. But for the crowd, the show was complete. They saw something real, something human, something so feudal and to their minds deeply worth attending. Ready for another show? Next, you'll wander down a cobblestone path and into a street corner where someone has chained up a live bear for the afternoon's amusement. That's right, bear baiting is next. Bring a strong stomach. You follow the sound of drums, barking dogs, and something that definitely should not be growling in the middle of a city. As you turn the corner, you're greeted by a crowd clustered around a makeshift arena, a low wooden ring erected hastily between two taverns. Inside it, tethered to an iron stake, stands a live bear, muscles rippling beneath its matted fur, eyes darting from face to jeering face. It growls low and shifts its weight, heavy iron collar clinking as it moves. Around the perimeter, a pack of dogs snarls and lunges, straining against handlers who can barely contain them. Welcome to bear baiting, the charming Victorian pastime that somehow managed to combine animal cruelty, drunken sportsmanship and low-grade warfare in one afternoon. It's early, but the crowd is already tipsy. The beer flows freely. Children clutch sticky pastries and climb onto crates to get a better view. Someone sells pickled eggs from a bucket. The air smells like ale, sweat, and the unmistakable tang of fear. And it's not just the bear that's afraid. Bear baiting had been around for centuries by the time the Victorians inherited it, but rather than casting it aside as barbaric medieval nonsense, they simply made it more accessible. No longer confined to royal bear gardens or elite bloodsport arenas, these brutal spectacles made their way into city neighbourhoods, back alleys, and even travelling roadshows, where bears and dogs were carted around like circus props and offered up for weekend entertainment. The concept was horrifyingly simple. Tether a bear in place and then release one or more dogs, usually trained pit bulls, mastiffs, or bulldogs, into the ring to attack. The bear, often declawed or defanged to prevent too much carnage on its side, would defend itself as best it could. The dogs would bite, claw, and try to bring it down while handlers shouted from the sidelines and spectators roared their approval. The match went on until either the bear collapsed or the dogs did. Yes, this was fun. No one thought it was weird. Here's your disturbing fringe fact. The Victorians didn't stop with bears. Other animals, bulls, badgers, even donkeys were used in similar setups. A popular variation involved badger baiting, where a badger would be placed in a box or barrel, and dogs sent in one at a time to drag it out. The winner was the dog that succeeded. The loser? Often the badger. And eventually the dog too. To the modern mind, this is straight up deranged. But to the Victorian crowd, especially the working class, it was community entertainment. Bear baiting was loud, physical, and very public. It brought neighbours together. It was talked about for weeks. There were local legends, Old Nellie the bear, who reportedly survived over 100 fights. Three-toothed Tom, a bulldog, known for lunging directly at bear faces like he had something to prove. People bet money, they cheered, sometimes they sang. It was a party minus empathy. And yes, alcohol was involved, always. These events were drenched in beer and bravado. People got rowdy. Fights broke out in the crowd, adding a bonus level of chaos to the already disturbing centerpiece. Occasionally a bear would break loose. That's right. An enraged, half-maimed bear, stumbling and bleeding, crashing through a crowd of day drinkers and children. Several newspapers documented such events with the same tone you'd use to describe a streaker at a cricket match. Shocking, a bit funny, and absolutely memorable. But even in the heart of the 19th century, not everyone approved. Animal rights campaigns were beginning to form, and by the mid-1800s, activists started pushing back loudly. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, RSPCA, took particular issue with baiting campaigning against it in newspapers and lobbying for legislation. Moral reformers argued that animal cruelty bred societal cruelty, that watching a bear be torn apart by dogs was not only wrong, it was damaging, desensitizing, dehumanizing. Legally, things were messy. The Cruelty to Animals Act of 1835 made baiting illegal on paper, but enforcement was a joke. Police officers either turned a blind eye or, in some cases, joined the crowd. Organisers simply went underground, or mobile. They held events at night, in forests, or on private land where lookouts could warn of approaching lawmen. If you were caught, maybe a fine, maybe a public scolding, but the demand never vanished, and neither did the supply. Scholars today argue over what bear baiting meant. Some view it as a grim release valve, a way for a society oppressed by poverty and rigid social rules to feel powerful, even if only over an animal. Others see it as inherited bloodlust, ritualistic violence passed down through generations under the illusion of sport. Still others argue it was a form of distraction, encouraged to keep the poor entertained and unorganised. Bread and circuses, but with claws. Try running this show in modern times and you'd be slapped with 1,000 charges before you even set up the ring. Animal cruelty laws are fierce. So are public sentiments, and rightly so. Organising a fight between a bear and a pack of dogs would land you on every news outlet, every animal rights hit list, and probably the no-fly list too. You'd be arrested, sued into oblivion, and possibly banned from owning even a houseplant. And yet, some corners of the internet, some backwoods places on the map, still echo with whispers of similar things: illegal dogfights, cockfighting rings. Human fascination with violence isn't gone, it's just better hidden. But here, in this Victorian square, it's all out in the open. A bear roars, a dog howls, the crowd screams, and no one blinks. They call it tradition, they call it sport, they call it Saturday. You, however, might call it enough. Time to leave the ring behind and head toward another form of public spectacle, just as dramatic, but with far less fur. Next stop, watching buildings burn while the fire brigade shows off for the crowd. That's right, firefighting as spectator sport. The smoke curls up over the rooftops in a lazy grey spiral, and already you can hear the bells, those heavy clanging beasts mounted atop horse-drawn fire engines, announcing not just emergency, but entertainment. You follow the sound like everyone else on the street, the baker's boy still holding a tray of buns, a group of women in aprons, several men who clearly took the opportunity to flee their factory shifts. Children skip alongside the crowd, pointing at the rising plume like it's a parade float. There's no panic, no screams, just that rising giddy hum of public excitement because, let's be honest, something's on fire. And in Victorian England, that means it's time for a show. Welcome to the spectacular, chaotic and oddly fashionable world of firefighting as spectator sport, where danger was real, but so was the performance, and nothing brought out a crowd like a good blaze in the city centre. You arrive just in time to see the fire really going for it. Third floor ablaze, smoke boiling from windows, the wooden shutters sizzling like bacon. The building is a textile warehouse, which means it's packed with flammable materials, but no one's running, no one's evacuating. Instead, the street is packed, shoulder to shoulder, necks craned, hands shielding eyes from the sun and ash. You spot a vendor selling roasted chestnuts right in the middle of the crowd. Someone's opened a bottle of gin. 2 men are already placing bets on how long it'll take before the roof caves in. And then comes the fire brigade. Cheers erupt. Actual cheers. The engine arrives with drama. 4 horses galloping, hooves kicking up dust, brass fittings gleaming in the sun. The firemen are in uniform, of course, and they look more like soldiers than public servants. Hats tilted just so, moustaches impeccably curled, each man gripping his hose like a weapon. They pose momentarily for the crowd, and then, like actors hitting their cues, they leap into action. Except you'll notice, no one's particularly in a hurry. That's not to say they aren't brave. Victorian firemen were incredibly brave. But they also understood the value of theatrics. They were watched, admired, even fancied, and they knew it. Rescue attempts were often conducted with dramatic flourishes. A ladder extended slowly, then a pause for applause, a fireman carrying a child from the smoke, cloak flapping like a superhero. It wasn't unusual for the brigade to be celebrated in the papers the next day, not for how fast they put out the fire, but for how dashing they looked doing it. And this is no exaggeration. The 19th century saw the rise of private fire brigades, often funded by insurance companies or wealthy philanthropists, and they competed with each other, literally for speed, precision, and yes, public image. Each brigade had its own uniforms, equipment, and rivalries. Sometimes multiple brigades would show up to the same fire, leading to brawls over who got to put it out, while the building continued burning merrily in the background. This rivalry reached absurd levels. There were stories of brigades arriving at a burning house and refusing to act because the owner didn't have the right insurance plaque nailed to the door. If the wrong brigade showed up, they might just stand and watch, or worse, charge you for their services afterward. Meanwhile, the crowd cheered the escalating chaos, like it was part of the script. Here's a spicy little fringe fact. Some people suspected that fires were started deliberately just to test new equipment or train recruits, or, less generously, to give a brigade a chance to show off. Nothing like a staged emergency to boost morale and public donations. This appetite for spectacle extended into official demonstrations too. Fire drills weren't quiet affairs, they were ticketed events. Wealthy Victorians would gather in public parks or arenas to watch firemen race up ladders, douse mock buildings, and rescue mannequins dressed as fainting maidens. It was circus meets public safety, and people loved it. But not everyone was impressed. Reformers complained that the fire brigades were too focused on style over substance, that they wasted time preening instead of pumping water, that more lives could be saved if fewer minutes were spent posing on rooftops. These criticisms eventually led to the formation of the London Fire Brigade in 1866, a centralised and professional force that answered to public authority, not private profit. Still, old habits die hard, and many of those early firefighters continued to blend competence with a healthy dose of performance art. From a scholarly angle, this all tells us a lot about Victorian society. It was a time when danger wasn't hidden. It was embraced, dramatised, and occasionally monetised. Fires were tragic, yes, but they were also an excuse for pageantry. In a world where most people's lives were dreary, underpaid, and soot-covered, a fire was thrilling. It was visible, immediate, and ironically, sometimes the most exciting thing to happen all week. Now, let's fast forward. Today, if a building catches fire, you'd better believe the area will be cordoned off. The crowd pushed back, the cameras kept a respectful distance. Firefighters arrive in gear that is more practical than decorative. No top hats, no showboating, just quiet, dangerous, efficient work. And the public expected to stay the hell out of the way. Try holding a barbecue in the middle of a burning street today and see how fast you're tackled. If you cheer as someone escapes a fire with dramatic flair, you're likely to be scolded for being insensitive, or worse, arrested for obstruction. But in Victorian times, fire wasn't just a hazard, it was a community event. Something to see, something to talk about, something to dress up for even. People toasted the bravery, yes, but also the drama. It was an age of danger made glamorous, right down to the flicker of flames reflecting off a fireman's brass buttons. So as the fire begins to die, the crowd disperses, gossiping excitedly, someone reciting the events like a football match. Did you see how high the flames went? He jumped from the second story. You follow the smoke trail down a darker alley. You've seen buildings burn. Now you'll see what happens when bodies are dug up and sold, not by monsters, but by medical students. Get ready for a truly grim chapter. Grave robbing for science. The graveyard is quiet, or at least as quiet as a Victorian graveyard can be. Crumbling headstones, gnarled yews casting long shadows, the ever-present scent of damp moss and something older, sweeter, more unsettling. You'd think this would be a place for mourning, for whispering prayers and laying flowers, But not tonight. Tonight, this shadowy patch of ground is a marketplace. Because just behind that crooked stone angel, crouched in a shallow pit, is a young man with a shovel, a rope, and absolutely no intention of letting the dead rest. Welcome to the shady, dirt-caked underworld of grave robbing for science. One of the most bizarre and disturbingly practical Victorian industries that operated right under society's well-powdered nose. The body snatcher, though he'd prefer you call him a resurrectionist, thank you very much, works fast. He and his partner have already loosened the soil. No coffin has been cracked open yet, but they're close. They're whispering in the dark, timing each movement, making sure the nearby vicar's cottage light stays dark. Their goal? Not gold teeth, not jewellery, just the bee. Because in Victorian England, bodies were worth money, real money. Not in a grim black market way, but in the scientific, medical, for the good of humanity way. Although no one who lost a loved one to these midnight harvests would describe it so kindly. Medical schools needed cadavers, desperately. Dissection was the foundation of anatomy, surgery, and research. But acquiring fresh human bodies legally, that was the problem. Before 1832, the only legal source of cadavers for dissection in Britain came from executed criminals. And since the justice system eventually decided it was a bit much to hang people just to stock medical classes, the supply dried up for so fast, which led to a disturbingly practical solution: steal buds. This wasn't fringe behaviour, it was a widespread semi-organised profession. Resurrectionists weren't creepy loners, they were part of networks, sometimes even employed unofficially by the very institutions that condemned them. A typical team consisted of 2 to 4 men, diggers, lookouts, transporters. They'd sneak into graveyards late at night, dig down just enough to reach the coffin, smash it open, loop a rope under the arms or around the neck and haul the body out. Clothes were stripped and returned, oddly polite if grotesque, because selling a naked corpse for dissection was less risky than dealing with stolen garments, which were technically considered property. And here's your grim fringe fact. Resurrectionists had special tools: flattened shovels for quieter digging, curved iron rods for lifting the coffin lid without disturbing the headstone too much, and even collapsible carts for sneaking bodies down alleyways. These guys were efficient. The medical schools, for their part, played the game with a clean conscience and a dirt-streaked wallet. They paid in cash, no questions, no paperwork. The closer the body to fresh, the higher the price. Students might even help unload the corpses under cover of darkness. Surgeons, desperate to teach anatomy properly, looked the other way. As long as the corpse was human and relatively intact, no one asked who it used to be. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the public. Stories began to circulate. Families staying overnight at cemeteries to guard loved ones. Graves rigged with tripwires, bells, even spring-loaded coffins designed to make robbing them incredibly difficult and occasionally fatal. Some cemeteries offered watch services, for a fee of course, and mausoleums began being built more like fortresses, all stone walls and iron bars. The public outrage hit a boiling point with the infamous Burke and Hare case in 1828. These two men took things a step further. Instead of robbing graves, they murdered people, poor, vulnerable individuals in Edinburgh, and sold the bodies directly to Dr. Robert Knox for dissection. Over the course of 10 months, they killed at least 16 people. When they were caught, Hare turned on Burke to avoid execution. Burke was hanged, dissected ironically, and his skeleton is still on display today. A cheerful Victorian cautionary tale. That scandal led directly to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which legalised the donation of unclaimed bodies, mostly from workhouses and hospitals, to medical science. That meant more corpses, less need for shovels, but it didn't eliminate grave robbing entirely, because guess what? The demand was still higher than the supply, and resurrectionists weren't keen to retire. Scholars today argue about how we should see these men. Were they ghoulish opportunists desecrating sacred ground? Or were they a grim necessity, outsourced tools of medical progress in a system too squeamish to handle its own needs openly? Some say they were villains, others say they were the invisible labour behind every major advancement in Victorian medicine. And make no mistake, those advancements were huge. Modern surgery, organ mapping, and trauma care all owe a debt, however uncomfortable, to the bodies dug up under moonlight by men who risked prison and pitchforks. The surgeons, of course, got the credit. The resurrectionists got cash, occasionally a hanging, and zero sympathy. Now, let's say you try this today. Grab a shovel, sneak into a cemetery, dig up a fresh grave and cart the body off to a university. You'd be arrested so fast your ghost would be filling out paperwork. Grave robbing is still a crime, a big one, and medical institutions now rely on donated bodies, complete with legal documentation, ethical review and refrigeration. Modern medicine doesn't run on midnight shovels anymore. But if you listen closely in certain old graveyards, those slightly sunken plots, the ones with the stones leaning just a bit too far to the left, you might just feel the echo of it. The rustle of burlap, the creak of cartwheels on cobblestone, a secret history of science bought and paid for in silence, shadows, and just a little bit of dirt under the fingernails. Ready to turn the macabre up a notch? Good, because next we're heading to a festival where cats are literally set on fire to bring good luck. That's right. You've survived bear baiting and body snatching, now prepare yourself for the flaming feline madness of Victorian fire festivals. You smell the smoke before you see the crowd, thick and oily, the kind that clings to your hair and settles in the back of your throat. The sky is orange, flickering with flames, and people are cheering, not gasping, not weeping, cheering. You push your way through the throng, past the cider stands and the children with sticky cheeks, until you find the source, a giant bonfire, piled high with wood, tarred effigies, old furniture, and in some places, according to the more unfortunate regional traditions, a live cat. Welcome to the bewildering, bonkers, and thoroughly flame-happy world of Victorian fire festivals, where the line between celebration and cruelty wasn't just crossed, it was incinerated. Now let's clarify up front. Not all Victorian fire festivals involved feline barbecue. Most were just big raucous excuses to light stuff on fire in the name of tradition. Think Guy Fawkes Night, midsummer bonfires, and torchlight processions through villages while everyone sang songs and probably spilled their ale. But in some areas, especially in certain parts of England and across the Channel in France, those fires came with some extra features, notably the cat-burning effigies. Let's set the scene. You're in a small town square, it's Guy Fawkes Night, November the 5th, and the people are ready to party. There's a huge wooden platform piled high with firewood, coal, tar barrels and old junk. At the top is a human-shaped effigy, usually representing Fawkes himself, but sometimes morphing into political figures, or even just some unlucky stand-in for the enemy. The crowd begins to count down. A man with a torch touches it to the base, and flames roar to life. That part? Still relatively normal, even by today's standards. But in some towns, particularly in France during the 18th and early 19th centuries, and lingering into the Victorian era, a live black cat would be tied to the effigy, or placed in a cage and hoisted up over the fire. The belief that burning the cat would bring good luck, drive out evil spirits, and in some cases, cleanse the town of sin or misfortune. Yes, this actually happened. No, it was not universally accepted, but in some rural areas, it persisted far longer than you'd like to believe. Here's your fringe fact for the night. In the French city of Metz, a very official-sounding tradition involved burning a wicker basket filled with cats during midsummer festivities. City officials even participated. It was seen as ritual cleansing, part pagan leftover, part civic celebration. And while by the mid-Victorian period the practice was dying out, reports suggest that crowds still gathered to throw things into the flames, and that some animals, alive or dead, were still included. Superstition dies hard, especially when it's baked into civic tradition and doused in cheap wine. Back in England, Victorian bonfires were often more metaphorical than feline, but they were no less intense. Effigies of criminals, enemies of the crown, or unpopular landlords were regularly burned in public squares. Children made them. Adults paid for the best spots to watch them burn. In towns like Lewes, the tradition got so elaborate that entire parades of torch-wielding townsfolk wound their way through the streets in bizarre costumes, leading up to bonfire night, which looked more like a war zone than a festival. Sparks flew, flames leapt, eyebrows were lost. A great time was had by all. It was dangerous, chaotic, and to Victorian sensibilities deeply invigorating. These were people who lived highly regulated lives, corseted, moralised, stuck in jobs that paid in gruel and soot. A public fire was a sanctioned moment of release. You could shout, dance, burn something or someone in effigy. It was catharsis with kindling. Of course, there were consequences. Fires got out of control, buildings were sometimes singed. In one infamous case, a flaming effigy rolled off its pile and into the crowd, causing a stampede. Injuries? Yes. Regrets? Maybe. But the bonfire returned the following year even bigger. Because tradition. And what about the cats? As animal welfare gained traction in the mid to late Victorian period, public pushback against animal cruelty became louder. The RSPCA, founded in 1824, made it its mission to stamp out this kind of practice. They printed pamphlets, lobbied politicians, and shamed towns that still engaged in superstitious cruelty. Slowly, the traditions began to die off, sometimes replaced with symbolic gestures, like papier-mâché cats or fake animal sounds played over the fire. It was progress, but only just. Still, the deeper debate lingers. Scholars wrestle with the meaning of these fire festivals. Were they communal healing rituals? Social revenge parties? Pagan holdovers retrofitted with political angst? Some argue they were ritualized chaos, a moment each year when the social order was allowed to fray, burn, and then reset. Others say it was just human nature. Give us something to hate, something to burn, and a crowd to cheer us on, and we'll turn it into tradition faster than you can say light the match. And if you tried any of this now, any of it, you'd be shut down before you even struck a flint. Setting a public effigy on fire? Sure, maybe, with permits, safety measures, and a fire marshal 3 feet away. But try tossing in a live animal, even as a joke, and you'd be facing charges, protests, and possibly a documentary with Sarah McLachlan music. Society no longer tolerates that kind of cruelty, even wrapped in the foil of history. Yet the fire remains, symbolically at least. We still burn things in protest. We still hold fire festivals, albeit safer, less sacrificial ones. And we still gather to watch something fall apart in flames, because there's something elemental about destruction that feels, weirdly, like cleansing. So as the bonfire crackles behind you, the crowd singing an off-key rendition of "Remember, Remember," you pull your coat tighter and turn away from the flames. The warmth is fading, but the smell lingers. Charred wood, smoke, and something darker. You've seen the Victorians play with fire. Now it's time to see what happened when they decided clothing was the real danger. Next up, the shocking, deadly, and wildly flammable world of Victorian fashion disasters. You step into the parlour and the first thing that hits you isn't the heavy scent of pipe smoke or the thick perfume clinging to velvet drapes. It's the rustle. A dry, papery, staticky whisper that seems to come from the women themselves as they move through the room like walking kindling. Their dresses are massive, ballooning with crinolines the size of carriages, swishing with layers of silk and taffeta. Beautiful, yes, breathtaking, sure, but also lethal. Welcome to the polished, perfumed death trap that was Victorian fashion, where looking fabulous could quite literally get you killed. Tonight's soiree is glittering. Chandeliers sway, music drifts from the pianoforte, and everyone looks like a painting come to life. You watch a young woman twirl near the hearth. Her gown catching the firelight, then catching fire, and suddenly the room is screaming. Within seconds, the hem of her dress is ablaze, flames shooting up the skirts like they were made of oil. And honestly, they practically were. See, Victorian fashion wasn't just ornate, it was flammable. Crinolines, those wide bell-shaped underskirts, were made of stiffened linen or cotton stretched over hoops of steel whalebone, or sometimes even highly combustible cane. Add multiple layers of silk, gauze or muslin, all highly flammable and often treated with volatile dyes, and you had yourself a human-sized bonfire just waiting for a careless moment near a gas lamp, a fireplace or even a drop candle at dinner. And it happened all the time. Women, especially young women, died in terrifying numbers from dress fires. There are recorded cases of women simply brushing too close to a fire grate and going up in flames in under 30 seconds. Some tried to run, which only fanned the fire higher. Others froze, allowing the flames to consume layer after layer. The pain was unimaginable, the injuries fatal more often than not. Here's your fringe fact. Between 1850 and 1860, nearly 3,000 women in England alone died from dress-related fires. That's not a typo. 3,000. That's more than were killed in railway accidents during the same period. For a while, death by dress was considered an almost inevitable part of fashionable life, a risk you took for beauty. Society mourned the victims, and then promptly went back to complimenting how lovely that new lavender silk looked under gaslight. Some victims were famous. Oscar Wilde's half-sisters. Mary and Emily died horrifically when their ball gowns caught fire at a party in 1871. One tripped and fell into the hearth. The other tried to save her. Both died from burns. The press covered it breathlessly. Victorian newspapers loved a good fashion gone wrong headline. Doomed by crinoline and Inferno in the drawing room were regular features, and while women were literally dying for fashion, men were not immune to garment-related peril. Tight cravats could restrict breathing. Tall collars, starched to razor-like stiffness, were nicknamed father killers because they could slice the neck if a man nodded too abruptly. And let's not even start on the dangers of early hair products, which sometimes contained lead, mercury, or petroleum jelly with an attitude. But the fashion industry rolled on. Crinolines got bigger. Gowns got longer, dyes got bolder, especially with the rise of aniline dyes, synthetic colours created through coal tar chemistry. Sounds safe, right? These dyes gave Victorians dazzling hues never seen before, bright purples, emerald greens, and shocking yellows. But they also came with delightful side effects like toxic skin rashes, organ damage, and cancer. That lovely arsenic green in your bonnet. It might just kill you slower than the fireplace. So why didn't people stop wearing this stuff? One word, status. Victorian fashion was a power move. The bigger the skirt, the more room you took up, literally. The more luxurious the fabric, the more wealth you projected. Women were encouraged to be decorative, not practical. Being engulfed in a dress the size of a family tent was seen as feminine, dainty, desirable, safety be damned. Some reformers pushed back. The Rational Dress Society, yes, that was real, formed in the 1880s to promote less hazardous clothing. They argued for shorter skirts, breathable fabrics, and, shocker, not dying in your outfit. They were laughed at by mainstream society, but their ideas planted seeds that would eventually blossom in the 20th century when women began demanding not just fashion, but freedom from flammable oppression. Today we still flirt with dangerous fashion, high heels that destroy spines, shapewear that crushes organs, fast fashion full of synthetic chemicals, but at least most of it won't explode near a fireplace. Can you imagine explaining your outfit's fire risk to a modern insurance adjuster? So, this silk was dyed with coal tar and layered over a structure made of whale bones and hope. And then I stood next to an open flame because it was cold. Absolutely not. If you attempted to wear a full Victorian gown today, hoops, skirts, flammable dyes and all, you'd need a fire marshal's permit and probably a team of handlers to keep you from knocking over lamps, children or traffic cones. Not to mention the 6 square feet of personal space you'd require just to turn around without taking out a buffet table. But don't mistake our modern fabrics and fire codes for progress alone. Remember, back then beauty was built on danger. Looking elegant meant accepting risk. And for many women that meant trading safety for social survival, one flammable ruffle at a time. As the fire dies down in the hearth and the hostess dabs nervously at the scorched corner of the rug, you take one last look at the party. Beautiful, lethal. Whispering silk and soft gaslight and a quiet sense of dread. And somewhere outside another dress catches fire. Another story begins. Ready for one last plunge into Victorian madness? Excellent, because now we're heading to the world of public dental extractions. Yes, we have tooth pulling on the street with an audience, a violinist, and probably no anaesthesia. The violin starts first, soft, lilting, almost tender, not what you'd expect for what's about to happen. The crowd tightens, celling across the cobbled street, some standing on crates for a better view, others elbowing forward with that unmistakable look of anticipation that belongs more to a theatre audience than a gathering for medical assistance. In the centre of it all stands a tall man in a crimson waistcoat, a leather satchel at his feet, and a broad grin spread across his face like he's the host of some grotesque game show. This, believe it or not, is your street dentist. And today, he's putting on a show, because in Victorian England, if you had a rotten tooth and not much money, or not much sense, your best bet might be to walk down to the market square, find the guy with the biggest crowd and get your tooth yanked in front of everyone, no painkillers, no license, and definitely no privacy. This wasn't fringe medicine, this was entertainment. The dentist, though we're using that term generously, steps forward, waving a pair of gleaming metal forceps like a magician, about to pull a rabbit from a hat. A volunteer is already seated on a wooden stool, hands gripping their knees, eyes wide and unblinking. The crowd leans in, the violin swells, and then, without warning, the dentist lunges, clamps the tool around the offending molar and yanks. There's a sickening crunch, audible even over the music, and a pause, like the crowd needs a second to register what just happened. Then comes the roar of applause, mixed with a few retches from the back and a round of cheers like someone's just scored a goal. The patient slumps forward, probably on the verge of unconsciousness. The dentist holds the tooth aloft. Victory. Tooth extraction in public wasn't some last resort horror show. It was a form of public theatre. Travelling tooth pullers, sometimes referred to as tooth drawers, would arrive in town with all the flair of a carnival act. They brought musicians, banners, assistants dressed in absurd costumes, and of course props, piles of previously pulled teeth, jars of questionable tinctures, and colourful posters promising painless extractions. Spoiler, it was never painless. Some operated out of wagons, others just set up a stool in the street and got to work, and people came, lots of them. Not just for the service, though that was real, but for the drama. Watching someone get a tooth ripped out while screaming and flailing was good sport. It was physical, grotesque, unpredictable, the perfect midday distraction, and the dentists knew it. They were part doctor, part salesman, part showman. Some offered free extractions just to draw a crowd, then made money selling miracle elixirs afterward. Others had assistants pretend to be patients, faking dramatic recoveries to hype the product. The line between medical care and scam artistry was blurrier than a molar mid-pull. Fringe fact, one of the more notorious Victorian street dentists operated under the name Professor Quickpull. No formal training, no surgical background, just a flair for presentation and a knack for gripping and ripping. He wore a white suit, dyed his hair red for effect, and once claimed to have extracted 50 teeth in 1 hour, a record that no one really wanted to challenge. Whether the patient survived is another matter. For those who couldn't stomach the street show, there were alternatives, mostly worse. Traditional dentistry was still a nightmare. Formal dentists charged obscene amounts, used rudimentary tools, and worked without anaesthetics. Ether and chloroform existed, but they were rarely available to the average person. Numbing agents like clove oil or brandy helped a bit, until they didn't. And if you had an infected tooth? Well, hope you liked facial swelling, fever dreams, and possibly dying of sepsis in your parlour. Modern historians debate how common these public extractions really were. Some argue they were mostly a lower-class phenomenon, driven by poverty and desperation. Others point to middle-class curiosity, and the sheer popularity of such events as evidence that people of all social levels were fascinated by bodily pain as performance. It was, in a way, the Victorian version of reality television. Messy, embarrassing, morbidly irresistible. And no, this wasn't isolated to England. Street dentistry thrived across Europe. In Paris, tooth pullers were part of the regular street scene, sometimes setting up shop next to fortune tellers and puppet shows. In Italy, the music was louder. In Germany, they sometimes used animals in their acts, don't ask. And in America, we'll just say that snake oil salesmen were amateurs by comparison. Now imagine trying this in 25, setting up a folding chair in Times Square, holding up a pair of pliers, and inviting strangers to get dental surgery in front of a crowd. You'd be arrested before your patient could sit down. Medical licensing boards would converge, TikTok would explode, you'd be sued into oblivion. And rightly so. But in Victorian times, this was just another day on the cobblestones. Blood on the apron, coins in the pocket, tooth in the air like a trophy. The violin plays you out. The crowd begins to disperse, chattering and excitedly. The next patient, face pale but determined, steps forward, and the show begins again. As the curtain falls on this last chapter of oddball Victorian entertainment, you can't help but marvel at the sheer range of activities these people considered a good time, from maggot racing to fire dress fatalities, from public drownings to radioactive tea parties. They lived in a world where danger and delight often arrived in the same breath. You've survived it. Barely. But before we send you off to dreamland, let's take a moment to wind down, close the curtain gently, and let the soot and silk of the Victorian era fade into the quiet. So here you are, finally back in your own quiet room, the gaslights swapped for LEDs, the muddy streets replaced by carpet, and the sound of firecrackers and screaming onlookers faded to a gentle hum of your fan, just like I told you to turn on way back at the beginning. You made it. You survived the full, delirious tour of Victorian fun, though let's be honest, you probably shouldn't have. If time travel ever becomes a thing, let this be your official warning. Victorian England was not a vibe. Sure, it had charm. Cobblestone streets, charming tea sets, painfully beautiful dresses which might kill you, and the occasional X-ray party. But beneath the lace and soot lay a culture fascinated with spectacle, teetering on the edge of disaster, and weirdly committed to pretending it was all very dignified. Their games were often grotesque, their parties sometimes fatal, and their version of a good time involved a lot more fire, biting, bloodletting, and moral panic than you might expect from people who made doilies a competitive sport. Yet even in all that madness, somewhere between the maggot races and the flaming effigies, you caught a glimpse of what made the era so intoxicating. It wasn't just about repression and chaos, it was about escape. From poverty, from rules, from the grimness of everyday life. When the world is hard, sometimes the only thing left to do is dress up, grab a jug of gin, and see who's getting their tooth pulled in the town square. Now, the fire's gone out, the gaslight's dimmed. All that's left is the creak of a distant hoop skirt and the faint sound of someone whispering to a maggot. Time to close your eyes.